wherein Mr. Forbes explains himself. Even the boldest may flinch when confronted with that which is apparently a manifestation of the supernatural. Theydon and Forbes were standing in a chamber of death. To the best of their belief, they were alone in an otherwise empty flat, and those ominous words, coming from someone unknown and unseen, blanched their faces with terror. But Theydon was a healthy and athletic young Englishman, and Forbes was of the rarer order which combines a frame of exceptional physique with a mind accustomed to think imperially. Two such men might be trusted to display real grit if surrounded by a horde of veritable spooks. The door was thrown wide as they turned at the sound of the words, and Theydon recognized in a strange little figure wearing a blue serge suit, a straw hat, and brown boots, Furneaux, the man whom he had looked on as somewhat of a crank and visionary during their talk of the previous night. "You!" he gasped, and the note of recognition was sharpened by a sudden sense of dismay, almost of alarm, because of the overwhelming knowledge that now all his scheming had collapsed, while the representatives of Scotland Yard would regard him as nothing more than a poor sort of trickster. But Forbes was not in the habit of yielding to any man, no matter what his status, or howsoever awe-inspiring might be the department of state which he represented. "Who the devil are you, at any rate?" he cried angrily. "And what right have you to spy on gentlemen in this manner, listening to their conversation, and breaking in with a cheap stage effect obviously intended to startle?" Furneaux remained motionless, his feet set well apart and his hands thrust into his trousers pockets. The trim, natty figure, the spruce and summer-like attire, the small, wizened face, with its cynically humorous and wide-awake aspect, above all, a certain jauntiness of air and cocksure expression, certainly did not suggest a comedian fresh from the boards. "You tell," he said, nodding to Theydon. "This is Mr. Furneaux of Scotland Yard," said the latter nervously. He imagined he could detect in Furneaux's glance a mixture of amusement and contempt. Amusement at the notion that any amateur should harbor the belief that the two best men in the yard could be egregiously hoodwinked, and contempt of one who so far forgot himself as even to dare attempt such a thing in relation to a police inquiry into a murder. "I don't know, and care less, who Mr. Furneaux of Scotland Yard may be," went on Forbes hotly. "I resent his intrusion, and wish to be relieved of his presence." "Why?" said Furneaux. "I have given my reasons to the Home Secretary. That mere statement must suffice for you." "Really, I must ask you to be more explicit." "I visited the Home Office this morning, and placed such evidence in the hands of the Home Secretary that Scotland Yard will be requested to suspend all further investigation into the death of Mrs. Lester." "Do you mean that the Home Secretary has sanctioned the breaking off of this inquiry?" "In the conditions, because if that is what your words imply, Mr. Forbes, I may tell you at once that I don't believe you. It is more than any Home Secretary dare do, and if you harbor any lingering doubts on the point, go to Mr. Theydon's telephone, ring up the Home Office, and tell the gentleman at the other end of the wire exactly what I have said. Of course, you don't really mean anything of the sort. By virtue of some special and inside knowledge of certain facts communicated to the Home Secretary, you may have persuaded him to promise that, provided the ends of justice are not defeated thereby, every precaution will be taken to keep the main lines of the inquiry secret until the whole position can be laid before the law officers of the Crown. The Home Secretary may have gone that far, Mr. Forbes, but not 1 inch farther, and you know it." The two antagonists, so singularly disproportionate in size, were yet so perfectly matched in the vastly more important qualities of brain and nerve, that the contest lost all sense of inequality. Theydon felt himself of no account in this duel. He was like an urchin watching open-mouthed a combat of gladiators. Forbes, not without a perceptible effort, choked down his wrath and recovered his poise. You have gauged the state of affairs accurately enough, he said, speaking more calmly. May I then recommend you to consult your direct superiors before carrying your investigations any further, Mr. Furneaux? Charles Francois Furneaux. Just so, Mr. Charles Francois Furneaux. I give you my full name because one of the peculiar features of this case is the inability of some persons mixed up in it to recall names, or even the mere salient facts. And the detective's glance dwelt for an instant on Theydon, who again, in his own estimation, shrank into the boots of a fourth-form boy detected by a master in an overt breach of college rules. But the little man was speaking impressively, and Theydon compelled his wandering wits to pay attention. "It will clear the air, perhaps," went on Furneaux, "if I point out that if anyone here is playing the spy, carrying on some underhanded game, that is, it is not I. These apartments are in charge of the police. The manager of the whole block of flats and the porter of this particular section have been warned that no one can be allowed to enter number 17 on any pretext until our inquiry is closed. Now, Mr. Forbes, kindly explain how you contrived to get possession of a key." An experienced man of the world like Forbes could hardly fail to see that he was in a false position, and that any persistent attempt to browbeat the detective would not only meet with utter failure, but might possibly compromise him gravely. "That was a simple matter," he said. "Mrs. Lester's servant left her key in Mr. Theydon's establishment. Bates surprised both his master and me by producing it when I expressed a wish to examine the place." "But why adopt such a clandestine method?" Forbes's face, usually so classic in outline, assumed a certain rigidity, and his firm chin grew markedly aggressive. "I don't answer questions put in that way," he said. Furneaux laughed sardonically. "You meet with greater respect in Capel Court, I have no doubt," he snapped. "There you stand on a pedestal, with one hand flourishing a cheque-book and the other resting gracefully on the neck of a golden calf. Here you are simply an ordinary citizen, behaving in a suspicious manner. If the uniformed policeman on the neighboring beat knew what I know of your recent movements, he would arrest you without ceremony, and charge you with being concerned in the murder of Mrs. Lester. Between you and Mr. Theydon, the work of my department has been hindered and burked most scandalously. Don't glare at me like that. I don't care tuppence for your millions and your social position. What I do care about is the horrible risk you and each member of your family are incurring. You know why, and while you are still alive, I mean to force you to speak the truth. Tell me now why Mrs. Lester was killed. Tell me, too, why the same hand which thrust a little ivory skull into the dead woman's under-bodice caused a similar token to be delivered to you by this morning's post. Ah, that touches you, does it? Now, my worthy financier and philanthropist, step down from your pedestal and behave like a being of flesh and blood." Forbes positively wilted under that extraordinary attack. His white face grew wan, and his eyes dilated with surprise and terror. The detective's words seemed to have the effect of a paralytic shock. Thenceforth he was underdog in the fight. "How do you know," he gasped, "that I received an ivory skull this morning? Have you been to my house? Did my daughter tell you?" Furneaux chuckled. "You're ready to listen, eh? Well, I don't mind telling you that I have not stirred out of this flat since 7 o'clock this morning, and I question if your letters were delivered in Fortescue Square at that hour." "I give in," said Forbes curtly. "Need we remain here? The smell of that cursed joss-stick oppresses me." Then Theydon found his tongue. "If Mr. Furneaux cares to abandon his vigil, my flat is entirely at your disposal," he said. "My vigil, as you accurately describe it, has ended for the time being," said Furneaux, apparently mollified by the millionaire's surrender. "I was sure that if I remained here long enough I would clear away some of the fog attached to a case which promises to be one of the most remarkable I have ever investigated. Come, gentlemen, let us be amiable to one another. I'm sorry if I lost my temper just now, but I regard myself as being the only detective in existence who uses other sections of his brain than those governed by statutes made and provided, and it riles me when men of superior intelligence, like yourselves, treat me as though my mission in life was to direct the traffic and keep a sharp eye on mischievous juveniles. Mr. Theydon, can that soldier servant of yours make coffee? His wife can, said Theydon. Will you be good enough, then, to set her to work? Thus far, since the sun rose, I have stayed the pangs of hunger with an apple and a glass of water. By this time Theydon had thoroughly revised his first estimate of the diminutive detective. Indeed, he was beginning to look on him as quite a noteworthy person, a man whose mental equipment it was most unwise to assess at any lower valuation than the somewhat exalted one which Furneaux himself had set forth with such refreshing candour. As for Forbes, the millionaire seemed to have sunk into a species of stupor since Furneaux spoke of the ivory skull. He uttered no word until the three were seated in Theydon's room, and his expression was so woebegone that it stirred even the mercurial Jerseyite to pity. I imagine that a cup of coffee will do you also a world of good, he said. Then, whirling round on Theydon, he stuck a question into him as if each word was a stiletto. Where do you get your coffee? At the grocer's, was the surprised answer. Is that all you know about it? Yes. Singular thing, isn't it? Mused the detective aloud. How idiotic men and women can be in their attitude toward the supreme things of life. What is of greater importance than the food we eat and the liquors we drink? Through them the body reconstitutes itself hourly and daily. Providence gives us a perfect engine, yet we clog and choke its shafts and cylinders by supplying it haphazard with any sort of fuel and lubricant, no matter how unsuited either may be to its purpose. Take coffee, for instance. The physiological action of coffee depends on the presence of the alkaloid caffeine, which varies from 0.6% in the Arabian berry to 2% in that of Sierra Leone. Again, the aromatic oil, caffeine, which is developed by roasting, increases in quantity the longer the seeds are kept. Unfortunately, coffee beans lose weight during storage, so you have a clear commercial reason why grocers should not sell the best coffee unless under compulsion of an enlightened public opinion. Now you, Mr. Forbes, would never dream of putting your money into an investment without full and careful inquiry into the history and scope of the proposed undertaking, while our young friend here would snort furiously at a split infinitive or a false rhyme. Yet when I submit the vital problem of the sort of coffee you imbibe, the very essence and nutriment of your brains and bodies, you hear the kind of answer I receive. All this, of course, was excellent fooling, intended to dispel the brooding horror which had suddenly descended upon Forbes, since it was borne in on him that the demoniac wrath wreaked on Mrs. Lester was now directed with equal ferocity against his family and himself. To an extent, Furneaux's scheme succeeded. A gleam of interest shot from the millionaire's eyes. They lost their introspective look. He even smiled wistfully. You are a man after my own heart, Mr. Furneaux, he said. I had no idea that the Criminal Investigation Department employed philosophers of your caliber. I suppose that you and I are about to swallow coffee containing indeterminate percentages of the chief constituents you named. One does not look at gift coffee in the cup, grinned the little man, obviously well pleased with himself. But if ever you two gentlemen favour my obscure dwelling with a visit, and partake of a meal, you will have a strict analysis with every bite and sup. There is a grocer in Battersea who used to tremble at the sight of me. Now he has learned wisdom, and has quadrupled his trade by publishing learned disquisitions on the nature and quality of each principal article he sells. You ought to read his treatise on butter. He is an authority on the dietetic value of jam. The nutritive properties of his cheese are ruining the local butchers. Furneaux's efforts were rewarded when the really excellent beverage provided by Mrs. Bates was disposed of. Forbes seemingly atoned for his earlier secretiveness by placing every fact in his possession fully and fairly before his auditors. "Nearly 7 years ago," he said, "I made a very large sum of money by amalgamating certain shipping interests at a favourable moment. Thus, as it happened, I had at command practically unlimited resources when I was asked to finance the cause of reform in China. The wretched lot of the Chinese nation had always appealed to my sympathies. Some hundreds of millions of the most industrious and peace-loving people in the world have been exploited for centuries by a predatory caste. Given a chance to expand, freed from the shackles of the Manchus, the Chinese, in my opinion, contained the elements which go to form a great race. But the Manchus held them in bondage, body and soul, and so powerful is self-interest, there has never been an emperor or statesman who strove to elevate the masses who was not mercilessly assassinated as soon as he allowed his intent to become known. The only path to freedom lay through revolution, and I had reason to believe that the ruling faction could be overthrown by a well-organized and properly financed movement without the appalling bloodshed which often accompanies such dynastic changes. At any rate, I entered the conspiracy heart and soul, but I met with two difficulties at the outset. I could not exercise efficient financial control in London, and I could neither go and live in the Far East nor transact my business through ordinary banking channels. So I had to find a substitute, and my choice fell on a rising young barrister named Arthur Lester, whom I had known since he was a boy, who had married the daughter of an old friend. He had a taste for adventure, and was alive to the magnificent career which lay before one who helped materially in the rebirth of China. In a word, he went to Shanghai as my agent, and the outcome of his work there is the present Chinese constitution. Of course, as holds good in all human affairs, events did not follow the precise track mapped out for them. But, on the whole, he and I were satisfied. China is awake at last. The giant has stirred, and if his first uncertain steps have deviated from the open road of reform, Manchu arrogance and domination, at any rate, are shadows of the past. But, unhappily, the conquerors, who have been so efficiently thrust aside, have now embarked on a secret campaign of vengeance and reaction. A society which calls itself the Young Manchus is inspired by one principle and one only, and that is death to the reformers. I don't suppose you gentlemen follow closely the trend of affairs in China, but you must have read of the assassinations of prominent men reported occasionally in the newspapers. Furneaux clicked his tongue so loudly that Forbes stopped speaking and looked at him, thinking apparently that the little detective meant to say something. He did, but it was Theydon whom he addressed. "I'd give a week's pay if Winter was here now, and I could see those big eyes of his bulging out of his head," he cackled. Theydon nodded. He understood perfectly. Then he caught Forbes's inquiring glance, and explained matters. "Mr. Furneaux hinted last night at some such development as that which your present statement conveys, and his colleague, Mr. Winter, pretended to scout it," he said. "Pretended?" shrieked Furneaux, instantly in a rage. "That was how it struck me," said Theydon coolly. "Didn't I drag the Chinese aspect of the crime out of him with pincers?" came the indignant demand. "Unquestionably. I only remark that your large-sized friend had it tucked away all the time at the back of his head." Furneaux pounded the table so viciously that the cups rattled. "Of course. He has a nose to smell joss sticks, and eyes to see an ivory skull. But didn't he say I was talking nonsense when I spoke about Shang-Ti scowling from a porcelain vase?" he shrilled. "Yes. For all that, I don't think he missed the least hint of your meaning." Furneaux gazed at Theydon fixedly. "Sorry," he said, with an acid tone that was almost malicious. "I imagined you were so busy throwing dust in our eyes that you wouldn't have noticed such fine shades of perception on Winter's part." But Theydon was now able to measure this strange little man with some degree of accuracy. He only smiled. As a thrower of dust, I was a most abject failure, he said. Fernot smiled, and turned to the millionaire. Pardon the interruption, he said. Like every artist, I am pained when my best efforts are scoffed at by heedless mediocrity. You, at least, will understand what a big thing it was to deduce even the vaguest outline of the truth from the facts at my command. I certainly do, agreed Forbes. Until this morning, I was convinced that Mrs. Lester's death removed the one person in England who knew of my connection with the revolution in China. To revert to the young Manchus, they have secured far more victims than the world at large is aware of. I am sure that they poisoned Arthur Lester, and his wife held the same view. They aim at nothing less than the extinction of the democratic cause by the murder of every prominent man connected with it. But they never yet have been able to obtain a full and authentic list of the reform leaders. They suspected poor Lester of complicity in the movement and killed him. It was through Mrs. Lester that I first became aware of their existence as an active organization, and I hoped that when she had returned to England and was living quietly in London, she would be lost sight of, ignored, in fact. Nevertheless, both she and I thought it prudent that our acquaintance should cease until the turmoil in China had subsided. For that reason, I never visited her, nor did I permit the growth of friendship between her and my wife and daughter, a friendship which, in happier conditions, would have been natural and inevitable. But we were woefully mistaken. An Oriental vendetta neither slackens nor dies. By some means wholly unknown to me, the young Manchus must have discovered, or guessed, that in leaving Lester's widow out of their reckoning, they had lost a promising clue. Be that as it may, they followed her to London, and, by a singular fatality, I was the first to know of it. Last Monday, while driving home from the city, my car was held up in Piccadilly for a few seconds. Looking idly out at the passing crowd, I saw a Chinaman in European clothes. He was waiting to cross the road, so I was able to scrutinize him carefully, and owing to a scar on the left side of his face, recognized him. His name is Wang Li-Fu, a Manchu of the Manchus, a mandarin of almost imperial lineage. Some years ago he was a young attaché at the Chinese embassy here. Suddenly, while on the way to my house, I recollected that certain members of the Revolutionary Committee had spoken of this very man as being one of the ablest and most scrupulous adherents of the Manchu faction in Peking. Somehow his presence in London was disconcerting and menacing. Who more likely than he, I argued, to be a leading spirit among the young Manchus? In any event, London was not big enough to hold both Mrs. Lester and him, and I decided to visit her that very night, telling her I had seen Wang Li-Fu, and advised her to go away into the country, leaving no record of her whereabouts. I happened to be taking my daughter to Daly's Theatre, and contrived to slip away on some pretext after the performance. I found Mrs. Lester alone in her flat, and she fell in with my views at once, because she, too, had heard of this very man, and the mere sound of his name terrified her. I was half inclined to urge that she should go to an hotel for the night, but the lateness of the hour, and the seeming fact that if danger threatened, she was safe, at least till the morrow, prevented me. Fernot, sitting on the edge of a chair, his head bent forward, his piercing black eyes intent as those of a hawk, a hand resting on each knee, his attitude curiously suggestive of a readiness to spring forward at any instant, now leaned over and tapped the millionaire decisively on the shoulder. "You couldn't have saved her, Mr. Forbes," he said gravely. "She was marked down as the first warning. Didn't the letter you received this morning tell you something of the sort?" Agitation gave place to utter astonishment in Forbes' face. "In heaven's name, how do you know anything of that letter?" he cried. "I will tell you later. But am I not right?" "Yes, you are." "Where is it? May I see it?" Forbes took a creased and soiled document from a small flat cardboard box which he carried in the breast pocket of his coat. But first he withdrew from the box a little object and placed it on the table. It was an ivory skull, and the very presence of such a sinister token brought some hint of the charnel house into the cosy and sunlit room. Fernot, a creature oddly constituted, either of all nerves or of no nerves, disregarded the skull. He had eyes only for the few words typed on a single sheet of note paper. They ran: James Creighton Forbes, if you are willing to come to terms, announce the fact by advertisement in Thursday's Times. Address your reply to Y.M. and sign it J.C.F. Yield, and you will hear further. Refuse, and no other warning will be given. The first counterstroke. Fernot apparently made up his mind with reference to the contents of a somewhat enigmatic message after one quick, unerring perusal. The man who wrote that took a great many things for granted, he said. He assumed, firstly, that you knew of Mrs. Lester's death and understood its significance. Secondly, that you are aware of the nature of the terms he will offer. Thirdly, that you may hesitate between compliance and threatened death. Y.M., of course, can be read as young man choose. Even there the writer exhibits artistic reticence. Frankly, Mr. Forbes, I wish you had come straight to Scotland Yard on Monday evening, instead of wasting those precious hours at Daly's Theatre. Forbes was moved to energetic protest. How was I to deduce the true nature of these hellhounds' mission from a casual glance vouchsafed of one who may or may not be their leader? He cried. Yet you treat your discovery as serious enough to warrant a prompt visit to the woman with whom association was dangerous. Yes, I wanted to act secretly. Just so? You were afraid the police would bungle the job. Between you and Mr. Theydon, you have exhibited remarkable skill in heading us off the scent. Fortunately, we were able to dispense with your assistance, having other matters to occupy our brains. You were two ripe nuts waiting to be cracked and have the contents extracted at leisure. There were a few freshly broken shells lying about, which invited immediate attention. For instance, some 4 months ago, a well-known and reputable firm of private inquiry agents was instructed from Canton to secure all possible information about Mrs. Lester and you. Yes, you, Mr. Forbes. Your household, friends, method of living, servants, tradesmen, every sort of fact, indeed, which might be useful to a thoroughgoing and well-organized society of cutthroats like the young man choose. The inquiry agents did their work well, and were handsomely paid for it. I haven't the least doubt that Wang Li Fu knows what brand of cigars you favor, and what you eat for breakfast. His informants sent us a copy of their notes an hour after the murder was announced in the newspapers. Mr. Lester is removed in Shanghai. His widow comes home. The inquiry agents receive instructions. They forward their report to Canton, and Wang Li Fu turns up in London. The program is a tribute to the excellence and regularity of the mail service between England and the Far East. While the detective was speaking, Forbes's face, already haggard, had grown desperate. I care little for my own life, he said, but I shall stop short of no measures to protect my wife and daughter. I certainly recommend that an armed guard should be on duty day and night in any house where you may happen to be living at the moment, replied Fernot airily. I really think that if your safety alone were at stake, I would do you a good turn by arresting you on suspicion. Of what crime? Of killing Mrs. Lester, to be sure. I regard you as a clever man, Mr. Fernot, so may I remind you that this is neither the time nor the place for a display of gross humor. Theydon expected that Fernot would flare into anger at this well-deserved rebuke, but much to his surprise the detective treated the matter argumentatively. Personally, I have looked on you from the outset as an innocent man, he said placidly. But just to show how circumstantial evidence may be twisted into plausible error, let me point out that nearly all the known facts conspire against you. Have you considered how dexterously a prosecuting counsel would treat your admission that Mrs. Lester was the only one person in England who knew of your connection with the Revolutionary Party in China? And how would you set about convincing a stolid British jury that you were acting in the interests of law and order in concealing your visit to number 17 on the night of the murder? These fine-drawn speculations, however, are a sheer waste of breath. Suppose we concoct an advertisement for the Times. Do you mean that I am to parley with these ruffians? Of course you are. But the Home Secretary agreed with me that no action should be taken until the Chinese legation had considered the matter. And pray, what can the legation do? They have their own sources of information. When all is said and done, Orientals are best fitted to deal with Orientals. Furneaux laughed sarcastically. If I remember rightly, the way in which the Chinese embassy dealt with one of your pet reformers some years ago did not win general approval. No, Mr. Forbes, we must try and circumvent the wily Chinese by other methods than torture and imprisonment. Of what avail will it be if this fellow, Wang Li Fu, is laid by the heels? Isn't it more than certain that he has plenty of determined helpers? Do you imagine that he killed Mrs. Lester? Not a bit of it. He will be able to produce the clearest proof that he was miles away from Innismore Mansions on Monday night. Now, let's see how we can get him to show his hand a little more openly. How would this be? Y.M. Terms can be arranged. J.C.F. The terms are, of course, that the whole gang be hanged or sent to penal servitude and deported. One moment, struck in Theydon. I have something to say before you decide on any definite action. I need hardly inflict on you, Mr. Furneaux, an explanation of my silence hitherto. I don't even apologize for it. Faced by a similar dilemma tomorrow, I should probably take the same line. But to adopt your own simile, now that Mr. Forbes has come out of his shell and admits his presence here on Monday night, my self-imposed restrictions cease. In the first place, then, Miss Beale came here this morning. Excellent. I wondered who the lady was. And secondly, the grey car which pursued me on Monday seems to have been partly identified later. A car resembling it in every detail deposited someone at the Chinese legation in Portland Place at an hour which corresponds closely with its presence here. Ah, that is important. I like that. I wasn't far wrong when I sensed you as an absolute carrier of clue germs in this affair, cried Furneaux. The Chinese embassy? Gasped Forbes. What car? And why should any car pursue you? Do you mean that you were followed on leaving my house? It was lamentable to watch the inroad which each successive shock was making on Forbes's physical resources. But Theydon affected to ignore the new fright in his eyes, and told him what had happened. Although he could see that Furneaux was in a fever of impatience to learn the later news, he thought that Forbes should know the facts, in view of the remarkable statement that he had visited the Chinese embassy that morning. In one respect, the recital was a test of the millionaire's professed readiness to deal candidly with the police. Theydon was half inclined to believe that the other was still wishful to conceal that part of the day's doings. But he was mistaken. When he had finished his own story, and given the taximan's version of the grey car's appearance in Portland Place, Forbes threw out his hands in a gesture of despair. If the embassy people are playing me false, I do not know whom to trust, he said brokenly. I have just come from there, and they assure me that if Wang Li Fu and his gang are in London, they are absolutely ignorant of the fact. Pooh! Cried Furneaux, snapping a thumb and finger. Don't worry about that. Put yourself in the position of the Chinese ambassador. He can't even guess who may be the ruler of China from one day to another. Yesterday it was an old wise woman, today a dictator, tomorrow the mob. Who can foretell what shape the lava erupted from a volcano will take? Bet you a new hat, Mr. Forbes, that the minute the embassy hears of Mrs. Lester's murder, they put two and two together and keep a sharp eye on these mansions and on your house. That gray car is nothing more nor less than a red herring accidentally drawn across the trail. Some cute Chinaman said, 'Hallo, that murdered woman is the wife of Forbes's agent in Shanghai. Now let's see what Forbes is doing, and who visits him, and perhaps we'll learn something. Wanna bet?' Forbes could not help but recover some of his shattered nerve in view of the detective's airy optimism. Still, he was shaken and dubious. "Don't forget that the Chinese ambassador has no knowledge whatsoever of my share in the revolution," he said. "And don't forget that for ways which are dark and tricks which are vain, the heathen Chinee is peculiar," retorted Fernot. "How can you be sure that there is not in the embassy at this moment a full statement of your payments into the reformers' funds, as well as the list of conspirators which our friend Wang Li Fu is in search of?" "I think that such a thing is almost impossible." "Is there really anything impossible? We used to believe that, once a man was dead, he could not be brought to life again. A Frenchman has just demonstrated that by a judicious application of galvanism to the heart and salt water to the veins, any average corpse can be revived." Evidently Fernot was enjoying himself. He sat there absorbing new impressions and irradiating scraps of irrelevant knowledge in a way that would have been full of significance to Winter had he been present. Fernot was never so mercurial, never so ready to jump from one subject to another, as when his subtle brain was working at high pressure. He actually revelled in a crime which lay on the borderland of the exotic and the grotesque. Like the French philosopher in Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination, the savant who read his newspaper in a dingy Paris room, and solved by sheer force of intellect extraordinary criminal problems which baffled the shrewdest official minds, he felt, in relation to this particular tragedy, that he required only to be brought in touch with certain contingent forces bound up with it, Forbes, for instance, and in a minor degree Theydon, and in due course he would be able to go forth and find the master wrongdoer. Suddenly the millionaire seemed to cast off the cloak of despair which clogged his energies and impaired his brilliant intellect. He rose to his feet, and involuntarily squared his shoulders. "Surely we are wasting valuable hours which should be given to action," he cried. "I am going to the city, and shall arrange for a prolonged absence from my office. Then I'll hurry home, perfect my defences, and defy these murderous curs. My wife must come to London. In a crisis like this I must have my loved ones under my own personal supervision. I can still shoot straight and quick, and woe betide any man, white or yellow, who enters my house unbidden. As for this infernal symbol," he raised a clenched fist, and would have pounded into fragments the thin fabric of the ivory skull, still lying where he had placed it on the table, had not Fernot snatched it into safety. "No, no," protested the detective. "I want that for purposes of comparison. Kindly give me that typed note, too, Mr. Forbes. It may bear finger marks, you can never tell. The cardboard box in which it was posted also, thank you. Now a few more questions before you go. How much money did you provide for the revolutionaries?" "2 millions sterling." "As a gift or as a loan?" "If they failed, I lost every farthing, of course. If they succeeded, I was to recoup myself by financing the new government." "But I gather that they have neither failed nor succeeded. China has a constitution, but the presidential election was conducted on lines suspiciously akin to those recently adopted in Mexico. Nevertheless, negotiations are now on foot for a big loan." "If you died, what would become of the 2 millions?" "They would be lost irretrievably." Fernot sat back in his chair. "That gives one furiously to think," he said. "The grey car comes back into the picture." "What do you mean?" "I don't know, but I'll tell you what. The man who first spoke of a Chinese puzzle as a metaphor for something downright bewildering knew what he was talking about." Forbes put a hand to his forehead in an unconscious gesture of hopelessness. "My brain is reeling," he muttered. "To think that in the London of to-day we should live in abject terror of a band of Mongolian ruffians. Why do you remain here, man? You vaunt the prowess of your department. Why are you not scouring every haunt of Chinamen in the East End? Spread your net widely, and you will surely get hold of some minor scoundrel who will talk for fear or money. Bribe him to the point where he cannot refuse to speak. Wang Li Fu is the only man I fear. Put him where he can accomplish no mischief, and the rest of his crew will be powerless. When you come to count up the achievements of my friend Winter and myself, in the face of stupid but none the less disheartening obstacles, we have not done so badly in 2 days," said Furneaux complacently. "Can I drive you anywhere? My car is waiting." "No, thanks. The truth is, Mr. Forbes, I look on you as a disturbing influence. A man who can talk as calmly as you about dropping 2 millions on a crazy project to introduce Western methods into China is not fitted for the phlegmatic and judicial atmosphere of Scotland Yard. If I want any money, I'll come to you. If not, and all goes well at number 11 Fortescue Square, the next time I'll trouble you will be when you are asked to identify Wang Li Fu, dead or alive." Forbes seemed hardly to be aware of Furneaux's words. He went out. Theydon accompanied him, and as they descended the stairs together, the older man said brokenly, "It is my wife and daughter for whom I fear. I can hardly control my senses when I think of these yellow fiends contemplating vengeance on me through them. Theydon, do you believe in that detective? He is either a vain fool or a genius. By the way, I forgot to ask him how he found out that I had received the warning delivered by this morning's post." "I'll try and worm an explanation out of him. If he tells me, I'll telephone you later. He is an extraordinary creature, but abnormally clever at his work, I am sure. For my own part, I feel disposed to trust him implicitly. I wish you had met his colleague, Chief Inspector Winter. He is the sort of man whose mere presence inspires confidence." Forbes halted on the step of the automobile and glanced at his watch. "I shall be home in an hour," he said. "After that I shall not stir out all day. Telephone me if you have any news. Why not dine with us tonight?" Theydon's eyes sparkled. He was longing to meet Evelyn Forbes once more, but a wretched doubt diminished the glow of gratification which the prospect brought. Should he, or should he not, tell the girl's father of the rather indiscreet admissions she had made during their brief talk that morning? That minor worry, however, was banished suddenly and forever. Furneaux, taking the 3 steps which led from entrance hall to pavement with a flying leap, cannoned right into Forbes, whom he grasped with both hands, quite as much by way of emphasis as to check the impetus of his diminutive body. "In with you," he piped. "Tell your chauffeur to obey my orders, no matter what they are." Action, determination, were as the breath of the millionaire's nostrils. He aroused himself instantly. "You hear, Downes?" he said to the chauffeur. Downes was one of those strange beings who have been evolved by the age of petrol, an automaton compounded seemingly of steel, springs, and leather. He had long ago lost the art of speech, having cultivated delicacy of hearing and quickness of sight at the expense of all other human faculties. The old-time coachman possessed a certain fluent jargon which enabled him to chide or encourage his horses, and exchange suitable comments with the drivers of brewers' drays and market carts. But the modern chauffeur is all ear for the rhythm of machinery, all an eye for the nice calculation of the hazards of the road 50 yards ahead. At any rate, Downes mumbled something which resembled "Yes, sir." Forbes sprang in and slammed the door. Furneaux raced round the front of the car and perched himself beside Downes, and the heavy automobile was almost into its normal stride before it had travelled twice its own length. Theydon was left gaping on the pavement. He saw that the car turned west, and caught a glimpse of Furneaux's outstretched hand, with forefinger pointing like a barrel of a pistol. "Fool!" he cried in bitter self-apostrophe. "Why didn't I jump in after Forbes? Now I'm out of the hunt. I wonder what the deuce Furneaux saw or heard. That concluding thought sent him back to the flat 2 steps at a time. "Bates," he shouted, "has Mr. Furneaux used the telephone, or did anyone ring up?" "No, sir," said Bates, coming hurriedly at the urgent call. "Fust thing I knew he was tearing out and running downstairs like mad." "Oh, double-distilled idiot that I am!" growled Theydon again. "Why didn't I go with them?" As though the gods heard his plaint and meant to crush him with their answer, the telephone bell sounded at his elbow. Mechanically he lifted the receiver off its hook, and immediately became aware of Tomlinson's voice, with some element of flurry and distress in its unctuous accents. "That you, Mr. Theydon?" said the butler. "Yes." "Have you had any news of Mr. Forbes, sir?" "Yes, he has just left me." "Ah, if only I had known, and had given you a call before ringing up the city." "What is it? Can I do anything?" "It's Miss Evelyn, sir." "Yes, what of her?" "She's gone, sir." Theydon's heart apparently stopped for a second, and then raced madly into tumultuous action again. "Gone? Good Lord, man, what do you mean?" he almost groaned. "A telegram came from Mrs. Forbes at Eastbourne, saying she was ill and wanted Miss Evelyn. I tried all I knew to persuade Miss Evelyn to wait until she had just spoken to her father, but she wouldn't listen. She just threw on a hat and a wrap and took a taxi to Victoria." Some membrane or film of tissue, which might have served hitherto to shut off from Frank Theydon's cheery temperament any real knowledge of the pitfalls which may beset the path of the unwary, seemed in that instant to shrivel as though it had been devoured by flame. He knew, how or why he could never tell, that the girl had been drawn into the plot which had already claimed so many victims and sought so many more. All doubt vanished. He spoke and acted with the swift certainty of a man tackling an emergency for which he had prepared during a long period of training and expectation. "Mr. Forbes may arrive at any moment, Tomlinson," he said. "Tell his office people to let you know if he goes to the city first. When you hear from or see him, say that I have either accompanied or followed Miss Evelyn to Eastbourne. If I do not catch the same train, I shall take prompt measures in other respects. Got that?" "Yes, sir." It was easy to distinguish the relief in Tomlinson's utterance, relief mingled doubtless with astonishment that a comparative stranger should display such an authoritative and prompt interest in the family affairs. "That is all. Write down my message, lest you omit any part of it." Theydon rang off. "Come," he said to Bates, who had not retired to his den, but was listening, discreet yet rabbit-eared, to these queer proceedings. Followed by the manservant, he darted into the sitting-room and did several things at once. He unlocked a drawer, and took from it a considerable sum of money, which he kept there for emergency journeys, also pocketing an automatic pistol. Pouncing on an ABC timetable, he looked up the trains for Eastbourne. A fast train left Victoria at 1:25 p.m. The hour was now 1:05. Meanwhile he was talking. "Bates," he said, "I promised Miss Beale, the lady who came here this morning, that my sister, Mrs. Paxton, would visit her this evening, say about 6. Miss Beale is staying at Smith's Hotel, Jermyn Street. Go to Mrs. Paxton and see her, waiting at her house if she happens to be out. Tell her everything you know about Mrs. Lester's death, and ask her to take care of Miss Beale this evening. She will understand. I'll wire her at Smith's Hotel before the dinner hour, if possible. If anybody calls here, I leave it to your discretion and your wife's whether or not they should be informed of my movements. Mr. Forbes or the police, of course, must be told everything. Miss Forbes is probably in the 1:25 p.m. train for Eastbourne, and I am going with her. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "I'll wire or phone you later." Grabbing a straw hat and a bundle of telegraph forms, Theydon vanished, not even waiting to slam the outer door. Bates, who had seen service, knew that men in time of stress and danger acted just like the detective and his own employer. "By Jingo!" he muttered, beginning to assemble the empty coffee cups on a tray. "Things is waking up here, and no mistake." Theydon was fortunate in finding a taxicab depositing a fare at a neighbouring block. Just before he reached the vehicle, a gentleman hurried out of the building and forestalled him. Theydon dashed up and caught the other man by the arm. "My need is urgent," he said. "Let me have this cab." The stranger smiled good-humouredly. He was an American, and had not the least objection to being hustled by a Britisher. Indeed, he rather appreciated this exhibition of haste as a novel experience. "I'm on a hair-trigger myself," he said pleasantly. "I want to make Victoria pretty quick. Can I give you a lift?" "I'm in with you," cried Theydon. "Now, cabby, half a sovereign if you get us to Victoria, Brighton line, in 15 minutes. I'll pay all fines." Then they were off, and the transatlantic cousins were banged against one another as the cab whirled around in sharp semicircle. "Say," cried the American, "this reminds one of home. I've been here a week, and had a kind of notion that London air was half fog, half dope. But you're awake all right. Bet you a 5-spot you're after a girl." "I pay," said Theydon, his eyes glistening. "And such a girl! Her portrait on the paper wrap of a 50-cent novel would sell it in millions." "Gee whiz, is it like that? Go right ahead, Augustus. Never mind me. Take this old bus all the way to Paris. I'll find the fares and hold your hat, but kindly shift that gun into your opposite pocket. You've dug it into my thigh quite often enough. If you want to get first drop on the other fellow, shove it up your sleeve." Sharp work. The American's easy-going badinage provided the best sort of tonic. Theydon laughed as he transferred the pistol from one pocket to the other. "My motto is defense, not defiance," he said. "I hope sincerely that I shall not be called on to shoot, or even threaten anyone. Using firearms, although for self-protection, is a very serious matter in this country. May I ask your name? Mine's Theydon. I live in those mansions we've just quitted." "And I'm George T. Handyside, 21097 Park Avenue, Chicago," was the answer. "Is that your telephone number?" "No, sir, it's my home address." "Well, Mr. Handyside, if ever I come to Chicago, I'll travel along Park Avenue and give you a call. How many days' journey are you from the center of the city?" "Say, Mr. Theydon, I'm real glad to make your acquaintance. I haven't been joshed that way since I left the steamer. This little island of yours is all right as a beauty spot, but I do wish your people wouldn't carry such a grouch agin life generally. Great Scott, it'll do 'em a heap o' good to try a real chesty laugh occasionally. Tell me where I can drop across you in London later in the week, and I'll see if we can't find a smile somewhere." The American scribbled the name of a Strand hotel on a card, which Theydon disposed in his pocket-book, at the same time producing one of his own cards. "You'll hear from me," he said. "Now, Mr. Handyside, pardon me for the next few minutes. I have to write telegrams." The first was to Forbes, addressed in duplicate to Old Broad Street and Fortescue Square. It ran: "If this message is not qualified by another within a few minutes, I am in the 1:25 train for Eastbourne." Then to Winter: "Young lady summoned to Eastbourne by telegram, stating that her mother is ill. Suspect the message as bogus, and emanating from Y.M. See Furneaux. He will explain. Am hoping to travel by the same train. If disappointed, will wire again immediately. Theydon." He read each slip carefully to make sure that the phraseology was clear. The speed at which the cab was travelling rendered his handwriting somewhat illegible, but he thought he saw a means of circumventing that difficulty. "Which place are you going?" he inquired of his unexpected companion. "To a place called Sutton." "What time does your train leave?" "Guess it's about 1:30. "You have 5 more minutes at your disposal than I have. Will you hand in these 3 messages at the telegraph office? I'll read them to you in case the counter-clerk is doubtful about any of my words." "Sure thing, Mr. Theydon. You've interested me. I don't care a row of beans if I drop out of Sutton altogether." "I'm greatly obliged, but that is not necessary. You'll have loads of time. We're in the park already, and our driver has a clear run to Victoria. Now listen." Mr. Handyside did listen, and pricked his ears at the mention of Scotland Yard. "Gosh!" he exclaimed. "This is better'n a Lifeline movie. For the love of Millie, let me in by the early door. Now, how's this for a proposition? You send those telegrams, and I'll fix the cab and buy the transportation to Eastbourne for the pair of us. I'm not heeled, but I may be useful, and I'll jab any fellow in the solar plexus that call." Theydon gazed at this self-avowed knight-errant in surprise. Handyside was a man of 40, whose dark hair was flecked with grey. He was quietly dressed. A wide-brimmed, high-crowned hat of finely plaited white straw, providing the solo note of markedly American origin in his attire. The expression of his well-moulded features was shrewd but pleasing, and the poise of a spare but sinewy frame gave evidence of active habit and some considerable degree of physical strength. "'Pon my honour," said the Englishman, "I'm half inclined to take you at your word, except in the matter of expenses, which, of course, I must bear. You see, if my services are called for, I may need help." "Go right ahead," said the other calmly. "Tell me as much or as little as you like. Where's this place, Eastbourne? On the south coast, I guess." "Yes." "I thought it would be. A man on the steamer asked me to come and see him at Westgate, which is about as far east as you can go in England without getting your feet wet. I'm getting the hang of things here by degrees. Southport, of course, is away up north, and Northamptonshire in the Midlands." Theydon grinned, but the taxi was passing Buckingham Palace, and the hour was 1:17 p.m. "I cannot give you any sort of explanation now, Mr. Handyside," he said. "Later in the week, perhaps, I may have a big story for your private ear. All I can say at this moment is this. I have reason to believe that a young lady, a daughter of Mr. James Forbes, a well-known man in the City of London, is being decoyed to Eastbourne in the belief that her mother is ill. Now, I may be wholly mistaken. Her mother may be ill. If that is so, I am making this trip under a delusion. At any rate, my notion is to try and fall in with Miss Forbes, accidentally, as it were, and watch over her until I am quite sure that she is with her mother. You follow me?" "Seems to me," said the American imperturbably, "it's the most natural thing in the world that Mr. Theydon should want to show his friend Mr. Handyside of Chicago England's most bracing and attractive seaside resort, if that's the right way to describe Eastbourne. Both the plan and the description are admirable." "A plan sounds all right. As for the description, I have been looking up a selection of posters, and those 7 words apply to every half-mile strip of beach in the island. When it comes to a real showdown, your poster artists have got our real estate men skinned a mile. How much did you promise the taxi man?" "Half a sovereign." "2.50. Gee, that's the nearest thing to New York I've struck yet. And the railway tickets. First class, of course?" "Yes." The cab stopped. Theydon sprang out and raced to the telegraph office, where, as he anticipated,
There was a slight delay. Handyside awaited him at the correct barrier, and together they walked down a long platform, Theydon peering into every carriage, though convinced that Evelyn Forbes would not travel other than first class. Thus, not being a detective, but only a very anxious and perplexed young man, he had eyes only for such ladies as were already seated in the train, and failed to note the immediate interest his appearance aroused in a man who occupied a window seat, and who was watching, unobtrusively, every one who passed. Oddly enough, after the first wondering glance, this observer was more closely taken up with Handyside. It was as though he said to himself, "Theydon I know, but who in the world is his companion? And why are they travelling by an Eastbourne express, to-day of all days?" The train was well filled. There were only a few seconds to spare when Theydon came across Evelyn Forbes in a compartment which held two other passengers, a lady and a gentleman. Recognition was mutual, and Theydon flattered himself that he betrayed just the right amount of pleasurable astonishment. "Miss Forbes!" he cried, raising his hat. "Well, of all the unexpected meetings! Don't say you are going to Eastbourne." "But I am," she said, and though she smiled, her eyes were heavy with unshed tears. She was deeply attached to her mother, and the thought that the loved one was too ill even to communicate with her by telephone was distressing beyond measure. "Just imagine that," went on Theydon, determined to rush his fences and travel with her, unless openly forbidden. "I'm taking an American friend there for the afternoon. May we come in your carriage? Is there room for two?" Now, although Evelyn Forbes had been attracted to Theydon during their vivacious conversation overnight, she would vastly have preferred the comparative solitude of a journey with strangers. Still, she could hardly refuse such a request, and common sense told her that a pleasant chat with a man who could talk as well as Theydon offered a better means of whiling away 2.5 hours than brooding over the nature and extent of her mother's unknown illness. "There's plenty of room," she said. Without further ado, Theydon entered, and Handyside followed. The compartment held 6 seats. The 2 remaining occupants were worthy Britons who neither invited nor received any special attention. Mr. Handyside was introduced, and promptly said the right thing. "I guess I knew what I was doing when I forced Mr. Theydon to take me out of London to-day," he said with a smile which left the girl in no doubt as to the nature of the implied compliment. "But it is hardly an hour since I spoke to my father at Mr. Theydon's flat," she said. "Were you there too, Mr. Handyside?" "No, in the next block. That was the nearest I got to Mr. Theydon before we met and took a cab for Victoria." Theydon was pleased with his ally. No diplomat, trained during long years to conceal material facts, could have headed the girl off more deftly without uttering a single untrue word. "Ah," she said, glancing meaningly at Theydon, "we are all the sport of fortune, then. How strange! Of course, Mr. Theydon, you don't know why I am here. I have had a telegram from my mother, or one sent in her name. She has been taken ill suddenly." "That is bad news," was the sympathetic answer. "If the message has not come direct from Mrs. Forbes, may it not be rather exaggerated in tone? Some people can never write telegrams. The knowledge that each word costs a halfpenny weighs on them like a nightmare." As he hoped and anticipated, She produced the message itself from her handbag. "This is what it says," she said, and read. "Mrs. Forbes ill and unable to communicate by telephone. Come at once. Manager, Royal Devonshire Hotel." Then she added, with a suspicious break in her voice, "That sounds serious enough, in all conscience." "Is it addressed to you personally?" said Theydon, racking his wits for some means of lessening the girl's foreboding, without tickling the ears of the other people in the compartment by suggesting that she might have been brought from her home by some cruel ruse of her father's enemies. "Yes." "But isn't that somewhat singular in itself? One would imagine that such a significant message would have been sent to your father." "Why?" "Well, men are better fitted to withstand these shocks, for one thing. It was heartless, or to say the least thoughtless, to give you such news with the brutal frankness of a telegram." "I cannot understand it at all. Mother wrote this morning, telling me that she was going to Beachy Head this afternoon with a picnic party." "I am convinced," said Theydon gravely, "that some one has blundered. I shall not be content now, Miss Forbes, until I have gone with you to the Royal Devonshire and learnt what the extent of the trouble really is. Then, if Mrs. Forbes needs your presence, perhaps you will allow me to telephone to your father, as he will be greatly disturbed when he returns home and learns the cause of your journey." "But I can't think of allowing you two to break up your afternoon on my account. I'm sure when we reach Eastbourne I shall see an array of golf clubs among your luggage." "No," smiled Theydon. "My friend here refuses to play until he has seen something of the country. He knows that the golfer's vision is bounded by the nearest bunker." Handyside took the cue. "That's the exact position, Miss Forbes," he said. "I was warned by the horrible experience of a friend of mine. He left Newark, New Jersey, on a sight-seeing tour of Europe, but unfortunately took his clubs with him. Now, if you ask him what he thought of Westminster Abbey or the Wye Valley, he tells you he hadn't time to look 'em up, but that the 5th hole at Sandwich is a corker, while the 13th at St. Andrews has been known to restore the faculty of speech to a dumb man. You see, some poor mute had either to express his feelings or bust." Evidently Miss Evelyn Forbes would not be allowed to mope during the run to Eastbourne. As between Theydon and herself, the situation was curiously mixed. On the one hand, Theydon had now a remarkably close insight into the peril which threatened Forbes and each member of his family. The girl, on the other hand, knew well that her father was bound up in some way with the tragedy at number 17 Ennismore Mansions. Nevertheless, an open discussion was out of the question, and the two accepted cheerfully the limitations imposed by circumstances, so that the strangers in the compartment little suspected what grave issues lay behind an apparently casual meeting between a pretty girl and two men that summer's afternoon in the Eastbourne express. The American played his part admirably. When not passing some caustically humorous comment on British ways and manners, he was being even more critical of his fellow countrymen. As he himself put it, he guessed New York society was mighty like London society with the head cut off, and proved his contention with many wise saws and modern instances. Thus the journey south passed pleasantly enough. When they alighted, the girl reverted to the topic uppermost in her mind. "You gentlemen will have to look after your own luggage," she said. "I'm sure you will forgive me if I hurry to the hotel. If you come there, Mr. Theydon, I'll take care that I see you at once. It is exceedingly kind of you to bother with my affairs." But Theydon had a scheme ready, having foreseen this very difficulty. "Mr. Handyside will attend to everything," he said glibly. "Please let me come with you. I shan't have a moment's peace until assured that Mrs. Forbes is suffering from little more than a slight indisposition." Evelyn looked puzzled, but was willing to agree to anything so long as she reached her mother quickly. Handyside, too, made matters easy by lifting his hat and walking off in the direction of the luggage van. "Well," she said, "I really don't care what happens, if only I lose no time." Suiting the action to the word, she hurried toward the exit, and was murmuring something that sounded like an apology for her seeming brusqueness, as they passed the ticket collector. Here a momentary difficulty arose. Theydon had forgotten to ask Handyside for his ticket. The girl, of course, had her own ticket, but her companion was not allowed to pass the barrier. He began an explanation, to which a busy official paid no heed. In desperation, he produced a sovereign and his card. "Here," he said, "you can hold this as a guarantee that my ticket will be given up. This lady has been called to the bedside of her mother, who is said to be dangerously ill, and I simply must be allowed to take her to the Royal Devonshire Hotel." Luckily, the railway man had the wit to see that this earnest-eyed passenger was speaking the truth. "That's all right, sir," he said. "We have to be very particular about tickets, you know." Evelyn Forbes was a few yards in advance, and impatiently awaiting her escort, when a gentleman approached and spoke to her. "Miss Forbes, I believe?" he said, raising his hat. "Yes," she answered breathlessly, because the man's garb suggested, before he uttered another syllable, that he was a doctor. He had a curiously foreign aspect, and spoke with a pronounced lisp. "I am assistant to Dr. Sinnett," he said, "and he has sent me to take you to the hotel. This is his car. Will you come quick?" He pointed to a smart limousine drawn up near the exit, and in his eagerness to be polite, almost pushed the girl toward the open door. Insensibly she resisted, and turned to explain matters to Theydon, who had just placated the Cerberus at the gate, and was running after her. "Mr. Theydon," she began. "There is no time to wait, I assure you," said Dr. Sinnett's assistant imperatively. At that instant Theydon came up. His temper was ruffled, and he did not scrutinize the doctor's appearance as closely as might be looked for in one who was actually on his guard against foul play. "What is it now?" he asked. "This gentleman has been sent by Dr. Sinnett to take me to the hotel," said Evelyn. "Now, Mr. Theydon, perhaps it will be better that you wait for Mr. Handyside, and come on at your own leisure." "I'm a stiff-necked person," said Theydon, trying to smile unconcernedly. "I've made up my mind to see you safely to your destination, and I refuse to leave you on any account. I am sure the doctor will let me sit beside the chauffeur." Then, for the first time, he glanced at the newcomer, and was almost stupefied to discover that the man, despite his faultless professional attire, was a Chinaman. Moreover, this Chinaman bore a livid scar down the left side of his face, and his eyes were set horizontally, a sure sign of Manchu descent, because all southern Chinese have the oblique Mongolian eye. Though prepared for treachery of some kind, the very simplicity of this scheme almost disconcerted him, and he blurted out the first words that rose to his lips. "Is your name Wang Li Fu?" Half unconsciously, a hand dropped to the pocket containing the revolver. For answer, he was struck a violent blow in the throat and sent sprawling. The attack was so sudden that he was nearly unprepared for it, nearly not quite, because a flicker of baffled spite in the dark eyes gave him the ghost of a warning. It was fortunate that he saved himself by a slight backward flinching, since he learnt subsequently that his assailant was a master of jiu-jitsu, and that vicious blow was intended to paralyze the nerves which cluster round the cricoid cartilage. Had he received that punch in its full force, he would have at least been disabled for the remainder of the day, and there was some chance of the injury having proved fatal. The Chinaman instantly seized the terrified girl in an irresistible grip, and was about to thrust her into the automobile, when a big, burly man flung himself into the fray and collared the desperado by neck and arm. "Stop that," he said authoritatively. "Let go that young lady, or I'll shake the life out of you." By this time Theydon was on his feet again, and rushing to the assistance of Chief Inspector Winter, who seemed to have miraculously dropped from the skies at the right moment. The Chinaman, seeing that he was in imminent danger of capture, released Evelyn, wrenched himself free by another jiu-jitsu trick, swung the girl into Winter's arms, thus impeding him, and leaped into the car, which made off with a rapidity that showed how thoroughly the chauffeur was in league with his principal. Naturally, the people coming out from the station, reinforced by the mob of semi-loafers, always in evidence in such localities, gathered in scores around Evelyn Forbes and her two protectors. Such an extraordinary scuffle was bound to attract a crowd. Few had seen the commencement of the fray, because nothing could be more usual and commonplace in a fashionable place like Eastbourne than the sight of a frock-coated and top-hatted gentleman handing a well-dressed lady into a motor-car. The first general intimation of something bizarre and sensational was provided by Theydon's fall. After that, events travelled rapidly, and the majority of the onlookers imagined that it was Winter who had knocked Theydon off his balance, while the rush made by the latter to intercept Wang Li Fu was actually stopped by a well-intentioned railway porter. Worst of all, Theydon was quite unable to speak. He indulged in valiant pantomime, and Winter fully understood that the Chinaman's escape should be prevented at all hazards. But the chief inspector accepted the inevitable. The limousine was equipped with a powerful engine, and the only vehicles available for pursuit were some ancient horse-drawn cabs. He noted the number on the identification plate, and that was the limit of his resources for the moment. Moreover, Evelyn Forbes, finding herself clutched tightly by a tall, stout man whom she had never seen before, was rather more indignant than hurt. Disengaging herself from the detective's hands, she looked to Theydon for an explanation. "Has everybody suddenly gone mad?" she said vehemently. "What is the meaning of this? Did you know who that man was? And why did he try to force me into the car?" Theydon, slowly regaining his breath, stammered brokenly that he would make things clear in a minute or so. Then he gasped to Winter, "That is Wang Li Fu, the man wanted at number 17. "We'll get him all right," was the grimly curt answer. "Meanwhile, are you and Miss Forbes going to the hotel?" Hardly less surprising than Winter's appearance on the scene was his seeming knowledge of the purpose of their journey. "We must get out of this," he went on, gazing around wrathfully at the ring of curious faces. "Here, you!" he cried, singling out a policeman who was forcing a passage through the crowd. "Clear away this mob, and get us a cab." The policeman seemed inclined to resent the masterful directions, but a word whispered in his ear when he reached Winter acted like magic, and he soon had the gapers scattered. A cab was called, and Evelyn Forbes was already inside when Theydon remembered the American. He looked around, but could see nothing of him. "Where is Mr. Handyside?" he said, still finding a good deal of difficulty in articulating his words. "Is that the man who came with you from London?" inquired Winter. "Yes, he's an American." "Well, he may have been scared and made a bee-line for the States. He's not anywhere in sight?" "Oh, please, Mr. Theydon, do let us go to the hotel," pleaded Evelyn. She was pale and yielding to reaction after the excitement of the fracas. Unwillingly, since he was certain now that there was absolutely no ground for the girl's alarm on her mother's account, at any rate so far as illness was concerned, Theydon entered the cab, and Winter followed. "The first thing to do," said the chief inspector, when they were en route, "is to assure this young lady, whom I take to be Miss Forbes, that she has probably been brought to Eastbourne by a lying telegram, and that her mother is quite well in health. Secondly, why should Wang Li Fu be described as the man wanted in the Innismore Mansions inquiry? And thirdly, how does Mr. Handyside come into the picture?" "I can't talk just yet," wheezed Theydon hoarsely. "In a few minutes I'll tell you everything." Evelyn had not realized earlier that her self-appointed champion had been seriously hurt. She was deeply concerned, and wanted to take him straight to the nearest doctor. But he smiled and essayed to calm her fears by whispering that he would soon be fully recovered. It was pleasant to know that he had succeeded in rescuing her from some indefinable, though none the less deadly, peril. Yet the insistent question in his subconscious mind was not connected with Evelyn's escape, or the flight of her assailant, or the mysterious presence of the chief inspector, but with the vanishing of Mr. Handyside. What had become of him? It was the maddest of fantasies to imagine that he could be bound up in some way with the young Manchus. Yet why did he fail to turn up at the station? Theydon could not even guess at a plausible explanation. He leaned back in the cab and closed his eyes. Really, there were times in life when it would be a relief to faint. Captures on both sides. Though Theydon was in first-rate athletic trim, that blow on the throat had nearly stunned him. The effort to rise promptly and bear a hand in the imminent capture of one whom he regarded as something akin to a homicidal maniac had imposed a further strain on his resources, and it was possible that he did actually lose his senses during a couple of seconds. In all likelihood, too, he changed colour slightly, because the next thing he was aware of was the note of alarm in Evelyn's voice, when she cried excitedly, "Mr. Theydon is really very ill. I'm sure we ought to try and revive him." At that he reopened his eyes and looked at her whimsically. Nature, in fact, had put forth a supreme effort. From that moment he recovered rapidly. Winter took a calmly professional view of the younger man's collapse. "There's nothing to worry about, Miss Forbes," he assured the agitated girl. "Our friend has just escaped being knocked insensible, if not killed. He was hardly prepared for such a vicious attack, I fancy. Most certainly that scoundrel took me by surprise, or he would not have slipped through my fingers like an eel. Next time, either Mr. Theydon or I may be trusted to balance matters." Theydon grinned and nodded. He signalled with his eyes that Winter was to make Evelyn Forbes understand
that she had just escaped being the victim of an extraordinary outrage. Muddled as his thoughts were, he grasped the essential fact that Scotland Yard was better posted in the secret history of the Innismore Mansions crime than he had given the department credit for before the dramatic meeting with Fernot that morning. And, indeed, the chief inspector lost no time in justifying that belief. "You must have imagined that the world had suddenly turned topsy-turvy," he said, smiling at the mystified and distraught Evelyn, as though the whirl of events outside the station were part and parcel of the humdrum routine of life. "When Mr. Theydon regains his speech, he will tell us how he came to suspect that an attempt would be made to kidnap you today. In my own case, intervention was the outcome of sheer and simple logical deduction. You see, I represent the Criminal Investigation Department, or Scotland Yard, as it is familiarly described, and I have reason to believe that your father is, and has been for some time, the object of unpleasant attentions by a political society in China, whose members are nothing more nor less than criminal fanatics. Probably this is the first you have heard of the matter, Miss Forbes. Your father would wish, no doubt, to keep any such disquieting knowledge from you and your mother. But the policy of concealment must cease now. Today's daring attack is a warning. Other efforts may be forthcoming. If you are to be protected efficiently, the police must have your loyal cooperation. I admit candidly that I myself, with all my experience, was taken off my guard a few minutes ago. If Mr. Theydon had not delayed that Chinaman, whose name he has got hold of from Mr. Forbes, I expect, I don't think I could have reached you in time." "Is that the meaning of the little ivory skull which my father received at breakfast this morning?" said Evelyn breathlessly. Winter's eyes twinkled. No question could have thrown a more vivid light into the sombre depths of a crime which promised to transcend in interest and importance any similar occurrence in Great Britain during the previous decade. "Doubtless," he said. "Of course, I have not yet seen Mr. Forbes, but we have a mine of information here," and he laid a friendly hand on Theydon's arm. "So far as I am concerned, I have had your house unobtrusively watched, for the protection of the inmates, I hope you understand, and I arranged also that anything unusual in the shape of telegrams or telephonic messages," here he glanced amusedly at Theydon, "should be communicated to the Yard. I heard, therefore, of Mrs. Forbes's sudden illness almost as soon as you did, and travelled with you to Eastbourne, intending to reach the hotel at the same time as you, and ascertain whether or not your mother was really ill. I saw you on the platform at Victoria, and guessed your identity. But in my profession we never take anything for granted, so I left that matter until I could interview the hotel manager. And here we are. I advise you not to say a word about Mrs. Forbes being ill. If, as I firmly believe, you find that she is in the best of health, you can explain your sudden visit by saying that Mr. Theydon and I have something of importance to communicate, which will be perfectly accurate, as a means to urge strongly that we all return to London by the next train." The cab stopped. To show that Richard was himself again, Theydon, nearest the door, opened it, got out, and helped Evelyn to alight. Reassured on his account, the girl smiled, and a wave of colour leaped to her cheeks. Anyone happening to watch their arrival would put them down as ordinary visitors. Evelyn Forbes was just a charming young woman, plainly but expensively dressed; Theydon an attentive cavalier, and Winter a prosperous city man, probably with a taste for coursing and pheasant shooting. Subtly observant, indeed, would be the theorist who gathered from their demeanour that they had just emerged, practically unscathed, from a situation rife with the elements of tragedy. Nevertheless, Winter kept a sharp eye on Theydon after Evelyn Forbes had run up the steps to the hotel, and was relieved at seeing that he could walk without assistance. "Keep nothing back," he said under his breath, as they followed the girl with sedater pace. "These women must be frightened into complete obedience. Did Fernot get hold of Forbes?" Theydon nodded. "That's right, don't talk. I can pretty well guess what took place. But look here,
Who's Handyside? A mere acquaintance? Another nod. You just contrived to pick him up and used him as an excuse for coming to Eastbourne? I see. That removes a troublesome pawn off the chessboard. But it doesn't, wheezed Theydon. He ought to be here. Can't make out what has become of him. He will turn up. An American, isn't he? I thought so. The indications were slight but certain. Features, walk, figure. You can buy clothes, but the genuine citizen of God's own country is as distinct a type as a Highlander, all wool and a yard wide. Inside the hotel they came on Evelyn, talking to the manager. She hailed them at once. "Mother has gone to Beachy Head," she cried. "She and her friends are expected home about 6 o'clock. Shall we have some tea? There is no use in following her. She will be starting back before we could get there." "Mrs. Forbes is quite well, I hope?" put in Winter, casually. "Yes, sir, in the best of health," said the manager, indicating with a flourish of both hands that nothing else was to be expected as to the condition of any among the numerous patrons of the Royal Devonshire Hotel. Evelyn asked that tea should be served in her mother's sitting-room. When they were screened by the closed door, Winter examined Theydon's throat. Beyond a slight swelling and external soreness, the cricoid cartilage, known to the multitude as Adam's apple, was seemingly uninjured, while Theydon himself now made light of the blow, though a certain hoarseness was perceptible in his voice, and he deemed it advisable to speak in a low-pitched tone. Evelyn Forbes listened with ill-repressed bewilderment while he related the day's doings. At first she hardly grasped the significance of the story, but Winter's occasional questions and comments, and a parenthetical sentence or two introduced by Theydon for her benefit, quickly revealed the astounding nature of the plot of which her father was the chief object. At this crisis she displayed a self-control and reticence which were admirable. She seemed to realize intuitively that any gaps in the recital could be filled in later, whereas it was all important that the detective should be made acquainted as speedily as possible with the developments brought about by the morning's fuller disclosures. As for Winter, he was keenly interested in Furneaux's behaviour at the moment of Forbes's departure from Innismore Mansions. Glancing at his watch, he rose when Theydon's revelations came to an end. "I'll just go and ring up the yard," he said. "There may be news. When Furneaux starts off in full cry, it is a wary fox that escapes him. I only wish you and I had travelled from Victoria in company, Mr. Theydon. Wong Li Fu would now have been in custody. However, we'll get him. If, as I imagine, he is making for London in that car, there is even a chance of intercepting him in the suburbs. I'll see to it." Left alone with Evelyn Forbes, Theydon suddenly grew tongue-tied. This man, who could invent all manner of glib conversation for the characters in his novels, now cudgelled his brains vainly for something to say that would dwell in her memory when they parted. And he knew why a cloud was thus effectually befogging his wits. He had only seen Evelyn 3 times in as many days, had spoken to her but twice, yet was hopelessly and irrevocably in love with her. He, who had so often and so thrillingly described the grand passion of a man's life, had now fallen a victim to it, only to feel how unutterably ridiculous and impossible was the wild longing that had sprung up in his heart. Here by his side, wistfully sympathetic and friendly in manner, sat the one woman in the world, yet he felt awkward and constrained, and took refuge in a vague expression of anxiety on behalf of Handyside, a man who at least might be trusted to extricate himself safely from the labyrinth of Eastbourne. The girl, of course, attributed these disjointed remarks to physical suffering. In reality, he was contrasting her wealth and his own comparative poverty, and bidding himself fiercely not to be a vain fool. "Don't you think you ought to call in the doctor?" she inquired tenderly. "No, no," he hastened to assure her. "The effects of the blow are passing rapidly. In another hour I shall hardly feel it at all. I'm afraid, Miss Forbes," he ventured to add, "that when this piratical gang is broken up, as certainly will be the case now that the English police are tackling it, you will associate our brief acquaintance with the only dark days in your existence." "Why do you say that?" she demanded. "Because I am bound to admit that if I had not dined at your house on Monday evening, many, if not all, of the amazing events of the past 36 hours could not have happened." "I don't agree with you, not one little bit," she protested emphatically. "Why, the detective man himself said that the young Manchus have been searching ever since the beginning of the year for proof of Dad's connection with the revolutionaries, and he was candid enough to tell us that if it hadn't been for you, that horrid Wang Li Fu would have got me into the car. No, Mr. Theydon, our meeting has proved most fortunate for me. Suppose I had really been captured, would he have gagged me and taken me away to some lonely place where I would be kept a prisoner, or even killed?" Theydon had no desire that her mind should dwell on such a harrowing topic. He shuddered to think of her fate if ever she fell into the hands of the miscreants who had not scrupled to murder Mrs. Lester. She evidently regarded the crime in No. 17 Innismore Mansions as the sequel to some political disturbance in far-off Shanghai. It had not occurred to her that a hapless woman had been done to death merely as a warning to her father of the fate in store for him and his if he did not yield to the demand of the reactionary party in China, and deliver over to their vengeance some hundreds of the leading men in that distressed country. "I doubt whether Wang Li Fu and his associates would have dared to offer you any real violence," he said. "At worst, I suppose they might have retained you as a hostage." "A hostage for what?" "For their claim against Mr. Forbes." "But what has he done? He has never been in China." "He is a power in the financial world. If the Reform Party cannot borrow money, the movement will collapse. At any rate, that is what the Manchus believe, and they will strain every nerve to effect their purpose." "But why did they kill poor Mrs. Lester?" Theydon felt that he was getting into deep water. This clear-sighted girl would soon have the various threads of the enigma in her hands, and then she could not fail but discover the true meaning of Edith Lester's death. "That phase of the problem has yet to be solved," was his non-committal reply. Winter rejoined them somewhat hurriedly. He looked puzzled and rather irritated. "Furneaux has made an arrest," he said. "A Chinaman, described as Len Shi, is lodged in the cells at Bow Street on a charge of being concerned in the Innismore Mansions murder. Furneaux is out, and that is all they know at the Yard. What I cannot understand is why no inquiry has been made, by telephone or otherwise, concerning Miss Forbes's flight to Eastbourne." The words had hardly left his mouth when the bell of a telephone on the table jangled. The coincidence was so peculiar that Winter laughed. "Some other person shares my opinion, I fancy," he said. "May I answer, Miss Forbes?" "Please do," said the girl, and the chief inspector lifted the receiver from its hook. "Trunk call from London. You're through," announced the hotel operator. After a slight pause, an agitated voice said, "Is that you, Evelyn?" "Miss Forbes is here," said Winter. "Who is speaking?" "Her father," was the reply. "Oh, I'm Chief Inspector Winter of Scotland Yard. Your daughter is quite safe, Mr. Forbes. Mr. Theydon and I accompanied her from London. She will speak to you in an instant. Would you mind telling me what happened at 1 o'clock, when my colleague, Mr. Furneaux, jumped onto your car and went in pursuit of someone? First, is Mrs. Forbes there too?" "She is out with a picnic party on Beachy Head. We expect her back before 6 o'clock. I propose bringing her and Miss Forbes to London tonight. They will be safer in your house than in Eastbourne, as you will probably agree when you hear what a narrow escape your daughter had this afternoon from being kidnapped by Wang Li Fu." "Great heavens! Evelyn in danger from that scoundrel!" "Yes, but all is well, believe me. Owing to Mr. Theydon's promptitude and pertinacity, Wang Li Fu's scheme was defeated. Your daughter will make everything clear. Give me the barest summary of events after your departure from Innismore Mansions, and I'll get out of the way." We pursued a car which led us a pretty dance nearly as far as St. Albans. It seems that Mr. Furneaux, looking out of the window of Mr. Theydon's flat, while Theydon and I were going downstairs, saw a Chinaman watching us from a closed car standing in the cross street at the end of the garden. He gave chase instantly, but as soon as the man realized that he had attracted notice, he tried to escape. At least, that was Mr. Furneaux's first impression. Later, he convinced himself that the supposed spy was little more than a red herring drawn across his trail, and that the man's real motive was to take me out of London, or waylay or detain me in some fashion, since it was manifestly impossible that my presence in the mansions should be known to anyone. I see now, of course, what the project was. If, as I gather from you, an attempt was to be made to capture my daughter on arriving at Eastbourne, it was all important for the conspirators that I should not know of her absence from home until after the arrival of the train, so that I could not communicate with the hotel and take measures to protect her. But that explanation was hidden from Mr. Furneaux, and the first glimpse of it vouchsafed to me was when I reached my office and was horrified to learn that she had gone away without my knowledge. However, in a desperate matter like this, I must not waste time by describing my agony and foreboding. As I have said, by some phenomenal method of reasoning beyond my comprehension, Mr. Furneaux did arrive at a sound conclusion. I suppose he was alive to the ridiculous aimlessness of the race across country. My car is powerful and speedy, but the Chinaman had a thoroughly up-to-date conveyance too, and drove without paying the least heed to traffic conditions. There was only one man, then? Yes. Didn't I make that clear? Perhaps not. But there can hardly be any doubt that this fellow was alone, and acting as a sort of scout, or vedette. We had the utmost difficulty in following him along Oxford Street, and I am sure that my chauffeur has been reported by a score of constables on point duty for exceeding the speed limit and disregarding signals to halt. To come to the material facts, the chase took us up the Edgware Road. We tore along at a tremendous rate after passing the Welsh Harp. Overhaul the fellow we could not, until, on the outskirts of St. Albans, when he deliberately slowed up as though to allow us to pass. Mr. Furneaux flew at him like a terrier grappling a rat, but the man made no resistance. He is undoubtedly a Chinaman, though attired in a chauffeur's livery, and he could handle a car in first-rate style too. His pidgin English was difficult to understand, and Mr. Furneaux shared my view that he did not try to render himself intelligible. We gathered that he was obeying his master's orders in trying the car, a new one, before purchase, but Furneaux bundled him off to the nearest police station, borrowed handcuffs, and brought him back to London, leaving the car in a garage at St. Albans. That is a bald but accurate summary of the facts. I dropped Mr. Furneaux and his prisoner at Bow Street, and was on the way to my city office, when I suddenly felt faint for want of food, as I ate hardly any breakfast this morning, and only drank a cup of coffee in Mr. Theydon's place. So I returned to the Carlton, where I met a friend, a business associate, who remained for a chat while I had a meal. This trivial accident prevented me from telephoning to my house, though naturally I had no misgivings as to my daughter's well-being. Even then I was detained unduly, because my friend and I went to another office in the city, and 2 more hours elapsed before I reached my own place. Then, and not till then, did I hear of Evelyn's journey and its cause. "Thank you, Mr. Forbes," said Winter quietly. "We seem to have made a forward move to-day. Before calling Miss Evelyn to the phone, I want to tell you that, in disobeying your orders to remain at home, she did my department a good turn. Wang Li Fu and I were brought face to face. He is not a myth." "My word might be regarded as sufficient proof of that fact." "Certainly, Mr. Forbes, if given earlier," was the inevitable retort. "But here is your daughter. She can plead her cause far better than I can." Evelyn took the woman's way. To defend, she attacked. "Dad, dear," she complained, "why didn't you give me your confidence? If I had had the least notion of the dreadful things that were going on, I should certainly have telephoned to Eastbourne before starting. But don't you see the diabolical cleverness of the scheme? The telegram arrived just in time to allow me to catch the 1:25 p.m. train, and rendering it idle to think of making a trunk call if I would only obey an urgent message from my mother. Then, again, when I reached Eastbourne, why should I suspect a foreign-looking gentleman who said Dr. Sinnett had sent his car to take me to the hotel? There isn't a Dr. Sinnett in Eastbourne at this date, but how was I to know that? Of course, both you and I have suffered a good deal, each in a different way, but all is well that ends well, and I shall have such a lot to tell you when we meet tonight. What time? I don't know yet. I'll wire or phone when Mother returns, and we settle about the train. Good-bye, darling. See you don't go anywhere alone until I come back. For some reason, Winter's manner was not so placid as usual. He looked so obviously perplexed and troubled that Theydon, searching for a cause, suddenly remembered that the chief inspector was a great smoker. "Won't you have a cigar?" he said. "That is, unless Miss Forbes has any objection." "Me?" cried the girl. "I don't object in the least." But the Royal Devonshire Hotel's best Havana did not wholly banish the frown from Winter's forehead. More than once he glanced at his watch and consulted a timetable. At last he voiced one of his anxieties. "What can have become of that American?" he said. "He knew what hotel you were making for?" "Oh, yes." They laughed. Quite a cheerful air possessed two members of the little party, at any rate. "Perhaps he has forgot the name," went on Evelyn. "Americans never forget the names of hotels, or railway stations, or steamers," said Winter. "The average Englishman can tell you what will win the Derby, but the average American will be a good deal more accurate concerning next Saturday's mail steamer. So, I frankly confess it, that man's prolonged absence supplies a riddle which I can't answer. What do you say if we give a look along the front? He may be shy, though I told the hall porter that any inquirer was to be shown up at once." No, Mr. Handyside was not to be seen on Eastbourne's spacious marine promenade. A couple of well-dressed men caught sight of Winter, and decided that they had instant and urgent business elsewhere, but he only smiled. His quarry that day was not the swell mobsman, but much more dangerous game. Lightning darted from a summer's sky when the picnic party returned from Beachy Head in 3 cars, but without Mrs. Forbes. Evelyn was hardly anxious at first. The hall porter informed her who the occupants of the cars were, and she watched the lively and chattering groups forming on the pavement and breaking up again to enter the hotel and dress for dinner. At last, realizing that her mother was not among them, she singled out a lady whom she knew, and asked for an explanation. The lady, a Mrs. Montague, was very much surprised. "But, my dear Evelyn," she said, "didn't you yourself send for your mother?" The girl blanched. Some premonition of evil gripped her very heart. "What do you mean?" she said, and the other woman could not help noting the distress in her voice. "If you didn't send, who did?" came the immediate response. "We were just going to have tea when a gentleman, a stranger, came and asked for Mrs. Forbes. We saw him arrive in a car which halted at the foot of the path, nearly a quarter of a mile away. Your mother answered, and he said that you were in Eastbourne and had sent him to bring you to the hotel. He said the car belonged to a Dr. Somebody, but he himself looked like a foreigner." A few others had gathered around, attracted by Evelyn Forbes's pallor and distress. Winter, too, had drawn near, and it was he who said, "Did you see this stranger who brought the message?" "Oh, yes, plainly," said Mrs. Montague. "Had he a scar down the left side of his face?" "Yes." Then Evelyn Forbes, for the first time in her vigorous young life, fainted. Her mother was in the power of Wang Li Fu. All the terrors which imagination had painted in her own behalf were redoubled as to her mother's fate. Her brain reeled. Merciful oblivion came. Theydon and Winter were just able to catch her before she fell like a log. The reappearance of Handyside. Consternation reigned for a while at the entrance to the Royal Devonshire. Men craned their necks, and women uttered nervous little shrieks. But Evelyn Forbes was endowed with a vigorous frame and a splendidly vital spirit, and she recovered her senses before she could be carried into the vestibule. The fact that she had fainted, too, brought to the aid of her waking senses the innate horror of her race and class for anything approaching a scene, and she was almost unnaturally collected in speech and demeanour within a few seconds after her eyes had reopened. "Did I give way like that?" she said with a valiant smile. "How excessively stupid! That sort of behaviour doesn't help at all, does it? Thank you, I can walk quite well. I'll just go to mother's room and telephone home. There has been some silly mistake. By this time it will be rectified, I'm sure. Come, Mr. Theydon, where's Mr. Winter?" "Here," said the detective. "I'll follow in a minute or so. Please don't communicate with London till I arrive." His quiet, insistent tone was meant rather for Theydon than for the half-demented girl, who was stumbling anywhere but in the right direction, until Theydon caught her arm and led her to the lift. She contrived to remain outwardly calm until she reached the seclusion of the sitting-room, when she broke into a flood of tears, while in disjointed and hysterical words she blamed her own rashness for the fate which had overtaken her mother. If only she had used better judgment when the telegram came! If only she had hired an automobile and driven straight to Beachy Head! If only she had done a dozen other things, which no one would possibly have dreamed of doing, she might have safeguarded her darling mother. Theydon, meanwhile, was nearly frantic with the indecision of ignorance. Never had he felt so helpless, so utterly childish and unhinged in the face of disaster. He had heard that it was good for a woman to be allowed to cry when overwhelmed with misery. Again, he remembered reading somewhere that the feminine temperament should not be allowed to yield to a too tempestuous grief, or the delicate and finely balanced female organism might suffer irreparable injury. Should she be given water or a stimulant? Should one leave her alone, or endeavour to soothe her? Heaven only knew. He didn't. So he did exactly what any devout and despairing lover might be expected to do, put an arm round her shoulders and murmured a frenzied assurance of his willingness to die several times, and vanquish a horde of young Manchus in the process, ere she could be allowed to endure one needless hour of distress on her mother's account. Somehow this sort of nonsense was helpful. The girl raised her swimming eyes to his. She placed two appealing hands on his shoulders, and said brokenly, "Mr. Theydon, I am ready to trust you next to my own father. Where shall we go? What can we do? I'll come with you, anywhere. Only my dear one must be rescued." He believed afterwards that he answered her by a kiss. He was not certain. The delirium of the moment was such that he could never recall its words or acts with that precision which a well-regulated mind should display even under the stress of intense emotion. In any event, the crisis was interrupted by the clamour of the telephone bell. Withdrawing from what was perilously near an embrace, so colourable an imitation of the real thing that Winter, entering at that instant, could make no distinction, and was secretly amazed at these strenuous methods of consoling the lady, Theydon lifted the receiver, and heard, as one in a trance, the telephone operator's conventional announcement, "Trunk call from Croydon. You're through." "Who is it?" demanded the chief inspector gruffly. Even he, veteran fighter in the unceasing battle between the law and the malefactor, was feeling the strain of the Homeric struggle ushered in by the death of Edith Lester. "I don't know yet," Theydon managed to say collectedly. "Someone from Croydon. Bend close, you'll hear." A quiet, drawling voice reached them, the vibrating wire lending its measured accents a metallic accuracy. "That you, Mr. Theydon?" "Why, it's Mr. Handyside. Yes, I'm here. Where are you speaking from? Croydon?" "That's so." "Well, I don't understand, but I'm sure you'll pardon me. We are in a deuce of fix at this end, so if you'll arrange to call tomorrow—" "You've lost Mrs. Forbes, I guess. Is that the lady's name? If it is, I've kept track of her. Theydon was so astounded that he looked at Winter in blank amazement. The pressure of his fingers on the circuit key relaxed, and the American's voice trailed abruptly away into silence. He put matters right at once, and heard the continuation of a new sentence, whereupon he broke in excitedly. "One second, Mr. Handyside. Miss Forbes is here. I must tell her your news." He turned to Evelyn. "Hooray!" he almost yelled. "Your mother is all right. She is with Mr. Handyside. Some sort of miracle has happened. Come and listen." Aroused from a stupor of grief, as though she had received a galvanic shock, Evelyn sprang up. Naturally, she had to place an arm on Theydon's back to permit of her head approaching near enough to the telephone. Thus the three heads were almost touching each other. If an artist had been present, he would have obtained a study in facial expressions worthy of Filmé or Guerrido. Handyside, of course, had heard Theydon's gleeful exclamation. He chuckled pleasantly. "Your digest goes a little too far, Mr. Theydon," he said. "But, compared with the newspaper placard facts in your possession, my story is a full-sized novel. Anyhow, I'll condense it, so here goes. I was back of the crowd when the circus started outside the Eastbourne depot. As I anteed up your ticket and collected your deposit of a sovereign, I saw what took place, and sized up the results pretty accurately. The kidnapping proposition had failed, but the guy in the silk hat had got clear away in a bully good car. How good, I know now. It seemed to me that, next to rescuing that charming young lady, it was important something should be known about the thug who wanted to carry her off. And when my eyes lit on a workmanlike motor-bike with a sidecar rig standing close to the curb and well clear of the arena, said I to myself, George T. Handyside, this is where you take a flyer, and maybe Illinois will score one. The man who owned the outfit was watching the commotion when I dug him in the ribs. Take me after that car, I said, and I'll pay you $1 a mile with £5 on account if it's only 100 yards. I pressed a note into his hand, and say, you Britishers wake up all right when you see real money. We were doing 30 per in less than 10 seconds. No car on 4 wheels can lose any decent motorcycle on a switchback track, and Jackson, the owner of this one, says it's good enough for 60 on a fair stretch of road. Anyhow, we held the thug dead easy, but didn't press him any, and I had no call to butt in, had I? Mr. Handyside, said Theydon, I won't waste time now by telling you how grateful we are. Get on with the knitting. Sir, I've had the time of my life. A rip-snorting movie with George T. on the film from A to Z. No, go away, Exchange. I'm renting this line for the next quarter of an hour. Well, we made a beeline for Beachy Head, so Jackson told me, and when the automobile pulled up, we got under a hedge, and I did a bit of scout work on my feet. I saw a silk hat pick out a lady from a bunch of people who seemed to be taking the view with sandwiches, and it was simple as falling off a log to follow the position of affairs. Silk hat urging lady to come with him, lady astonished, not able to size up exactly bearings of the yarn, but finally yielding. Now, if Miss Forbes hadn't told us that her mother had written saying she was going to Beachy Head with a picnic party this afternoon, I would have gotten off at the wrong address, because I could hardly have failed to believe that silk hat was picking up a female accomplice. But as things stood, I suspicioned that, failing the daughter, he was putting up a bunco tale for the mother, a situation new, I believe, in the realm of romantic fiction. I thought it was up to me to play a strong hand, so I threw a few facts on the screen for Jackson's benefit, and he straightway hit the pike in pursuit. Where the country was open, we kept well in the rear, but crept closer in villages and towns. We had to stop at Tunbridge Wells for petrol, but that didn't cut any ice because Jackson knew the country like a book, and we sighted the automobile within 5 minutes, though the milestones were pretty numerous during that run. After that, nothing particular happened, except to a hen and a dog, until we came near Croydon. That is, I knew it was Croydon because Jackson said so. I have considerable faith in him. In between whiles, where there was nothing doing, he and I fixed up an automobile tour. Well, outside Croydon there's a new road, with a half-built villa at the near end, and a way-back farmhouse at the other end. The villa was the one thing needed when the thug made a beeline for the farm. I jumped out, told Jackson to find something to do to his machine at the corner of the next block, and I hurried into the Alpine chalet. From a top back room I watched Silkat carrying a lady into the farm. What's that? Yes, he was carrying her. I guess he'd given her a dope so as to stop any cry for help. Made me feel pretty mean to be standing there without taking a hand in the deal, but I forced myself to believe that another hour or two couldn't make such a heap of difference to the lady, while it would be better to leave things to the police. I waited just 20 minutes, I have all the time scheduled, until the car came back. By hurrying downstairs, I was able to look inside as it passed, and Sulcat was alone. He took the London road. I strolled out, didn't dare to hurry, in case anyone might be watching from the farm, and put in some hard thinking while walking to Jackson's stand. There were two courses open, either to send Jackson after the auto and try myself to get in touch with you and the police, or put Jackson on guard near the farm. Whether I decided rightly or not, I haven't a notion, but I let the car go, and for this reason. We know where the lady is, and so does the thug. If the police put up a hard game, they can rescue her without his knowledge, and spread a web for the fly to walk into later. But they must get a move on. This phone is nearly a mile from the farm, and Jackson is tightening nuts outside the villa I spoke of. Now, what's the next item on the program? Winter grabbed the receiver unceremoniously. I'm a representative of Scotland Yard, Mr. Handyside, he said. If ever you want work, come to me, J. L. Winter, and I'll find you some. Miss Forbes is vexed with me because I have stopped her from thanking you, but compliments must wait. Will you go as quickly as possible to the chief police station at Croydon? By the time you get there, I'll be in touch with the inspector in charge, and he will do the rest. You understand? Goodbye. Winter rang off. He smiled blandly at Evelyn. There's no opportunity now for sentiment, he explained. Our American friend will appreciate quick action far more than talk. Then he tackled the telephone again and asked to be put through to the Croydon police station. There must be no delay, he added. This is an official call. He was in touch with Croydon in a remarkably short space of time, and soon was in communication with a police inspector. What's your name? He demanded. Inspector Wilkins, came the surprised answer. Were you a sergeant at the time of the Surrey Bank robbery? Yes, but what the— I am Winter of Scotland Yard. Do you recognize my voice? Well, do you remember that nip of old brandy I gave you while we were freezing in a drafty warehouse at 3 o'clock in the morning waiting for the smasher to come home for his plant? Yes, you're Mr. Winter, right enough, sir. Good. I want you to believe what I'm going to tell you, as there is a big job ahead. A gang of Chinese cutthroats have kidnapped a lady, wife of the London banker, Mr. James Forbes. In a few minutes, an American, a Mr. Handyside, will be with you. He will point out the house near Croydon to which the lady has been taken in a motor car. Collect half a dozen plainclothes-men and 2 in uniform, and go with Mr. Handyside, without attracting attention, of course. Surround the house, and arrest anyone, especially any Chinaman, who attempts to leave. Release the lady, and ask Mr. Handyside to escort her to her home, 11 Fortescue Square, Belgravia. If she's very ill, which is improbable, she should be taken to a hospital. In that event, Mr. Handyside should telephone Mr. Forbes. Occupy the farm, and arrest anyone who comes there, no matter what the pretext, until Mr. Furneaux or I arrive. I'll be with you in 2 hours. Tell Mrs. Forbes that her daughter will set out from Eastbourne by the next train, leaving after 6:30. Got all that? Yes, sir. Are these Chinamen likely to show fight? Better be prepared. But after posting your sentries, I advise you and the uniformed constables to rush the place. By the way, it will save me some trouble if you phone the Yard and tell them exactly what I've told you. Ask for Furneaux. If he's not in, instruct them to leave a written record for him. I'll see to it, sir. Is that all? Yes. Goodbye. Meet you in 2 hours. He whirled round on Theydon. Tell the manager to supply at once the best car to be had in Eastbourne for love or money, he said. I want something that is sure to go, and go fast. The chief inspector, with full steam up, was energy personified. His bulging eyes, his firm chin, his round fists, one clenching the telephone instrument, the other resting on the table, were eloquent of the man of action. His pride had been sore stricken by the escape of Wang Li Fu when that master scoundrel was actually in his grasp. But those powerful hands of his were far-reaching, and it would go hard with the jiu-jitsu expert when next they gripped his lithe frame. Almost before Theydon had quitted the room, Winter snapped, there is no other word for it, literally snapped a question at Evelyn. "What's your telephone number?" She told him, and again the Eastbourne Exchange was bidden to exert itself. "That you, Mr. Forbes?" said the chief inspector, after a short wait. "Yes." "I am Winter of Scotland Yard. I want to assure you that your wife and daughter will be under your roof within the next 3 hours. Mrs. Forbes will probably be escorted by a gentleman named Handyside, an American. You owe him all possible thanks, because it is due to his action alone that Mrs. Forbes will soon be rescued from captivity. Yes, she was carried off from Beachy Head this afternoon by Wang Li Fu, but by the rarest good fortune this Mr. Handyside, a friend of Mr. Theydon's, was able to follow the trail, and steps are now being taken to free her. Your daughter will speak to you. I intervened merely to vouch for it that an almost incredible story is true. By the way, let no one know that Mrs. Forbes is in London. Warn your servants not to speak of her return. One more word. Have you heard anything of Furneaux?" "I have not heard from or seen him since we parted outside Bow Street police station. But for heaven's sake, what is this you tell me about my wife?" "Miss Forbes will give you all the particulars we possess. Be calm and remain at home. You can best assist us by stopping within call. Mrs. Forbes and the American should arrive first, possibly before 7:30. If there is any hitch, which is unlikely, Mr. Handyside will telephone you. Your daughter will tell you the hour she and Mr. Theydon should reach Victoria. She will speak to you now. Excuse my abruptness. A lot of things may happen before I retire for the night, and I have no time to pick and choose my words." Evelyn, able at last to pour out her soul in thanksgiving, nearly broke down when she heard her father's voice. "Oh, Dad!" she wailed. "I've passed through a dreadful time since I spoke to you, shortly after 5 o'clock. I dropped as if I'd been shot when Mrs. Montague, who was one of the picnic party, told me that a man of foreign appearance, with a scar on the left side of his face, and who said he was a doctor, came to Beachy Head and told poor mother that I had sent for her." She went on to relate such facts as were known to her, and was in the midst of a sensational narrative when Theydon announced that a high-powered touring car was in readiness. "Won't you take us with you?" he said to Winter. "There is no train from here till 7:30, and in a motor we should be well on the way to London by that time." Winter had anticipated some such request, and a prompt refusal was on the tip of his tongue when he recalled that he would pass through Tunbridge Wells, whence an earlier train might be available. A glance at the timetable showed that a train left Tunbridge Wells at 7:15. "Yes," he said, "I'll take you part of the way. Tell your father, Miss Forbes, that you will arrive at London Bridge at 8:40. If you two reach London by a different route, I think you should be tolerably safe. If any Chinaman shows up between here and Fortescue Square, I'll shoot him at sight," Theydon said, producing an automatic pistol. "I wouldn't do that," smiled Winter. "You might bore a hole in some perfectly innocent Celestial. But you won't be troubled. Wang Li Fu carries out his own plans, and at present he is congratulating himself on the possession of a valuable hostage. But come along. How about a wrap for you, Miss Forbes? We'll create a breeze, you know." She ran into her mother's bedroom and came out with a fur coat and a motor veil, articles which, she had guessed correctly, her mother would not be wearing for the short run to Beachy Head. The hotel manager lent coats to the men, and they started, not without hearty congratulations from several people in the porch, whose fears on Mrs. Forbes's account Theydon had dissipated when he went out to order the car. Winter gave their thoughts a new direction when Theydon inquired what means the authorities would adopt to rid the country of the pestiferous gang which carried on its vendetta with such scant respect for the law and order of Great Britain. "Once we have Mr. and Mrs. Forbes and this young lady safely housed in Fortescue Square, and protected, not only by their own servants, but by the Metropolitan Police, we will devote ourselves to routing out the whole crew," he announced. My idea is that when we lay hands on the ringleader, the rest will be easy. Fernow's prisoner, Len Shi, may be got to talk when a Chinese interpreter tackles him. Again, there is every prospect of an important capture being made in Croydon House. Most important of all is the prolonged absence from the yard of Furneaux. He is busy, or he would have put in an appearance hours ago, if only to get to know my whereabouts. That means something. Furneaux never wastes time. Usually we hunt in couples. To-day, by the fortune of war, we are separated, and perhaps fortunately so. It is all your fault, Mr. Theydon." "Mine?" was the astonished cry. "Yes. We had to try all sorts of tricks on you before you would speak. Just imagine Scotland Yard being compelled to tap the telephone of a respectable and well-known author before he would own up to such knowledge as he possessed of the murder in number 17. So that was how Furneaux had played the necromancer, and was able to mystify Theydon that morning. The chief inspector, by raising the question, was touching on dangerous ground, as he was well aware, but he was determined now that all barriers should be thrown down. Evelyn Forbes was no bread-and-butter miss from whose cognizance the evil things of life must be sedulously averted. A woman of spirit and intelligence, who had already run the dreadful risk of sharing Mrs. Lester's fate, should be made to understand every phase of the difficulty with which the Criminal Investigation Department had yet to deal. British law and Chinese anarchy would soon grapple in a life-and-death conflict, and it was idle folly to suppose that, no matter how reticent her friends might be, this sharp-witted girl would not find out for herself the exact nature of the link which bound the fortunes of her own family with those of the dead woman. Theydon tried to pass off the detective's retort with a careless laugh, but Evelyn reverted to the topic when they were seated in the London-bound train after Winter had dropped them at Tunbridge Wells station. "What did the chief inspector mean when he said you refused to help him at first?" she inquired. "There are gaps in my history of this affair. How did you come to know that my father was acquainted with Mrs. Lester? Why did you seem at one time to be taking sides with my father against a public inquiry by the police?" Then, seeing there was no help for it, Theydon began at the beginning, and told the girl the full, true, and unexpurgated story of events on the Monday night. Once or twice, when he hinted at the cause of his otherwise inexplicable actions, which quite obviously lay in his interest in the girl herself, she blushed a little and averted her eyes. But she listened in silence, and did not speak during many seconds after he had ceased. Then she simply murmured, "Poor dear Dad! How worried he must have been, and how well he concealed it from me." After another pause, she added, "We are deeply in your debt, Mr. Theydon. When this ordeal is ended, and those horrid men have been put in prison or driven out of the country, our next difficulty will be to thank you adequately for what you've done. Surgit amari aliquid. Even in life's pleasantest hours something bitter arises. Theydon was in the company of the woman he loved, yet no word of love could rise to his lips. In the first place, he dared not woo the daughter of a millionaire. In the second, were his suit even possible, he was far too honourable-minded to take immediate advantage of her disturbed state, and the services he had undoubtedly rendered and given the slightest hint of his passion. So he sighed, and looked out of the window at a fast-flying vista of Kentish hillside, and contented himself by saying, "For what little I have done or attempted to do, I am already rewarded far beyond my wildest dreams." Even that was more than he had meant to say. Glancing timidly at Evelyn to see whether or not she resented his words, he was astounded to find that she had blushed scarlet, and in her turn was absorbed in the landscape. Then he remembered that in the frenzy of the moment following the report of her mother's capture by Wang Li Fu, he had kissed her. Had he? Or had he not? If not, why not now? But that way lay madness, and wretched doubt. Was she already the promised bride of another man? It was a relief when the train stopped at Sevenoaks. When it moved on again, they were normal young people once more, and discussed various features of the young Manchu's raid on society, as though the extermination of political adversaries were a commonplace occurrence in modern England. At last, after a journey which lived long in their minds, since even a prosaic train may follow the path to Wonderland, they arrived at London Bridge, and hummed in a taxi through streets of gaunt warehouses, until the light of Westminster flashed on a Thames veiled in the blue mystery of a summer gloaming. The cab had hardly halted outside the Fortescue Square mansion when the door was thrown wide open, and Tomlinson appeared, flanked by two stalwart footmen. The butler's face was aglow with pleasure. "It's all right now you've come, Miss Evelyn," he said joyfully. "Mrs. Forbes arrived more than an hour ago." But Tomlinson was in error. He did not know what tribulations loomed already through the haze of the future, or he would have laid to heart the time-honoured advice to venturesome travellers, "Never hallo till you're out of the woods."
No surrender. Mrs. Forbes, a slim, elegant woman, looked as if she were her daughter's elder sister. Although driven by hay fever to the seaside regularly at the beginning of the London season, she was far from being a malade imaginaire. She did not go willingly. Each year she hoped against hope that the annoying ailment would not make itself felt. Yet no sooner was the month of May well established than for 6 or 7 weeks she had either to drag her husband and daughter away from the metropolis, or live by herself in some South Coast hotel. She had tried Brighton, whence Mr. Forbes could travel to the city, but soon discovered that the daily train journey was not good for his health. After that she insisted on adopting the self-denying ordinance of leaving Evelyn with her father in the town-house from the middle of May till the end of June, when all three went to the Highlands. She, of course, had not the remotest knowledge of the terrors threatening her household. A thunderbolt out of a summer sky would have astonished her less than the indignities she endured when haled away from Eastbourne in the luxurious car which Wang Li Fu had at his command. Theydon had been in the house nearly half an hour, and was exchanging experiences with Forbes and Handyside, the latter, by virtue of his extraordinary share in the day's adventures, being admitted to the full confidence of the others, when Evelyn brought her mother into the library. "Here is someone who positively refuses to retire for the night until she has met you, Mr. Theydon," said the girl, radiant with joy and relief, now that the shadow of death had passed, apparently forever, leaving her dear ones unscathed. Mrs. Forbes, an aristocrat to the fingertips, greeted her guests with marked cordiality. "I have been living during the past few hours like one of the characters one sees in the fearsome little plays produced on the stage of the Grand Guignol in Paris," she said, gazing at him with frank brown eyes, singularly like her daughter's. "But I have contrived to gather one definite impression among the whirl of things, and that is, that were it not for Mr. Frank Theydon, my daughter and I would now be in as bad a predicament as two women could possibly face anywhere. I was lucky enough to be of some little use, but Mr. Handyside is the lion of today's contest," said Theydon. "I am grateful to both of you. How grateful, I can never find words to tell. But Mr. Handyside rivals you in modesty, Mr. Theydon. He assured me that you were the Deus ex machina, though he obtained the machine itself, and rode 60 miles to rescue me from my dragon. By the way, where is the motorcyclist? What is his name?" "Jackson, ma'am," put in Handyside. "He went back to Eastbourne, thought nothing of it. I fixed him all right. He's coming to London next week. I've hired him for a trip round the island." "In a sidecar?" laughed Evelyn. "No, I guess we'll run to something more roomy." "Jim, dear," said Mrs. Forbes to her husband, "get Mr. Jackson's address. Our thanks to him, at least, can take a tangible form. No, Evelyn, I'm not going to bed. I mean to sit up and talk. I want to hear everything. You men must smoke big, strong cigars, please. If I breathe tobacco smoke, I shall not fancy I want to sneeze." "I, for one, am simply aching to hear what happened to you," said Theydon. Mrs. Forbes was equally ready to retail her trials. "When a man who resembled a tall and well-built Japanese came to me on the Downs," she said, "I really believed him to be what he said he was, assistant to an Eastbourne doctor. I never dreamed he was Chinese. Not that it mattered at all where I was concerned. Only one becomes quite accustomed to meeting well-dressed Japanese men in society, but hardly ever a Chinaman. I thought, too, I remembered his face, which is quite possible, since my husband tells me that this Wang Li Fu was once an attaché at the Chinese embassy. He spoke excellent English, with a strongly marked lisp. When he said that my daughter wished to see me at the Royal Devonshire Hotel, and that a Dr. Sinnett had sent a car for my convenience, I was mainly concerned in getting him to admit the real cause of his presence, because I naturally assumed that Evelyn had met with an accident. No sooner had the car started than he seized my wrists and gave them a queer twist, which seemed to render me powerless for a few seconds. "If you scream or resist, I hurt you. So, only very bad," he said. I was that astonished, I hardly realized what was taking place, before he had my wrists and ankles strapped tightly, but not painfully, and had placed a gag in my mouth. "Now you keep quiet," he said, and showed me a horrible-looking knife, which he put on the seat between us. "If you move at all when we pass through towns," he went on, "I stick this into you very deep." Somehow I knew that he meant to carry out his threats to the letter. At first I was more angry than hurt, or even alarmed. Then I began to believe that I had fallen into the clutches of a lunatic, and grew horribly afraid. I saw that we were following the London road, and it oppressed me like a dreadful sort of nightmare to be speeding through a familiar district, a countryside dotted with the houses and estates of personal friends, and be unable to stir or utter a sound. It seemed to be almost stupid to see policemen in the streets of Tunbridge Wells, one of whom gazed into our car sharply, because I suppose we were travelling rather fast, and feel that no one could begin to guess at my predicament. You all appreciate the fact, of course, that I knew nothing whatever of any quarrel between my husband and a faction in China. "Your husband adopted the policy of the ostrich, Helena," said Forbes grimly. "It may or may not be a fable as regard to ostriches. I don't know enough about them to feel certain, but it is unquestionably too often true of mankind. I believed my head was hidden, and imagined the remainder of my body was safe in consequence. Now I learn that my opponents have been tracking me steadily for half a year. The one fact which stands out clearly above all others during the past 48 hours is the phenomenal range and completeness of Wang Li Fu's plans." "I didn't mean my comment as a reproach, dear," and Mrs. Forbes gave him a look which told plainly that these two were lovers after many years of wedded happiness. "Thank God we have all escaped, thus far." "Oh, mother," laughed Evelyn nervously, "you are not anticipating more horrors, are you? A few hours ago I would have scoffed at anyone who said that a handful of Chinese could tear aside our cloak of civilized security, as though it were a spider's web," was the serious reply. "But I have interrupted my own story. I began to think that I would be taken to some awful den in the East End, and held there till some huge sum of money was paid by way of ransom, when the car suddenly quitted the main road and bumped over a rough surface. I knew I was near Croydon, the last place I would have suspected as a brigand's stronghold. Then we halted, and that wretched man lifted me out, carried me into a back room of an old-fashioned house, put me in a fairly comfortable chair, tied me in with ropes, and left me. I couldn't speak. I was looking at a blank wall and smoke-stained ceiling. I was sure then that he was after money, and began to calculate the time which must elapse before my husband would hear from him and arrange for my release. I wondered how much he would ask. 10, 20, 50,000 pounds. How much would you have paid him, Jim?" Mrs. Forbes took her trial so cheerfully that they all laughed. "That's hardly a fair question, is it?" she continued, stealing another glance at her husband. "At any rate, being a banker's wife, I knew how extraordinarily difficult it would be to raise any considerable sum of gold at such a late hour, and I resigned myself to remaining a prisoner all night. Then I think I wept a little, but not for long, because I felt that they meant to keep me alive, and as I look more delicate than I really am, even a Chinaman would see that he was taking some risk by denying me food and all liberty of movement. Then, very soon, it seemed, I heard an outer door being forced off its hinges, and English voices, and the door of my room was broken open, and I saw a police inspector and some constables.
Hitherto I have never properly appreciated our policemen. From this day I become their most ardent admirer and enthusiastic helper. I could have gone down on my knees to those big, kind-looking men in uniform. In fact, I nearly did. When they released me, I could hardly stand. After that, Mr. Handyside came and accompanied me here, with a detective sitting next to the driver, and my husband and Evelyn have told me something of the extraordinary things which have been going on in London, while I was gadding about at Eastbourne." "Was the detective a man named Furneaux?" inquired Theydon. Mrs. Forbes hesitated, and her husband answered for her, as he alone, among the members of the household, had met the Jersey man. "No," he said. "He belonged to the Croydon force, and was sent as an escort. Furneaux seems to have been swallowed alive since 3 o'clock. Everybody is inquiring for him, and no one appears to know anything about him." "I wonder whether Wang Li Fu is aware I have been liberated," said Mrs. Forbes. "It's rather odd, is it not, that nothing has been heard from him or his gang, if I was to be held a prisoner in order to extort terms?" "I fancy he meant to add significance to his demand for a reply by advertisement in tomorrow's Times," said Forbes. "You see, Helena, he meant to carry off Evelyn as well as you." Mrs. Forbes smiled again at that. "What in the world should each of us have thought if we had both been bound and gagged in that car?" she cried. "I know what I think," said her husband emphatically. "You are going straight to bed now, and you'll take 10 grains of bromide before lying down. Evelyn, I appoint you nurse. Don't leave your mother till she's sound asleep." Mrs. Forbes rose at once. She admitted, though reluctantly, that a night's rest was necessary to steady her nerves. "Ah," she sighed, "I shall be so glad when all this turmoil is ended, and we are settled for the season in Sutherland." "Sutherland, ma'am?" inquired Handyside. "Isn't that in the far north of Scotland?" "Yes." "It would be, just as the North Foreland is in Kent." Theydon explained his friend's theory of geographical names in the British Isles, and on that lightly humorous note the ladies disappeared. When they were gone, Forbes quickly gave a sinister turn to their talk. He produced a letter from his pocket. "Listen to this," he said. "Y.M. is pleased to inform James Creighton Forbes that Mrs. Forbes is a prisoner, and will remain, without food or drink, and unable to move, in an empty house until Y.M.'s demands are granted." His face was white with fury while he read, and his fingers moved convulsively, as if he could feel them twining around Wang Li Fu's throat. The other men maintained a sympathetic silence. They understood why that ghastly message had been withheld from the cognizance of the lady who had just quitted them. "It was delivered by a messenger boy shortly before you arrived, Theydon," said Forbes, when his passion had subsided and he could trust his voice again. "Have you informed Scotland Yard?" said Theydon. "No, I dared not use the telephone. I could not leave my wife. She is far more shaken than she thinks. Ever since her return she has followed me if I even walked across the room. It was pitiful. I had to lie to her when the butler brought this infernal note. She saw it was typed, and believed my explanation that it was a mere record of an office cablegram." "Give it to me," said Theydon. "Mr. Handyside and I must leave you now. We'll take it to Scotland Yard. Mr. Winter ought to know of it. In all likelihood he is arranging to remain in the Croydon house to-night, and if Wang Li Fu is telling the truth, which is highly probable, the local police can watch the place adequately. Yes, you're right, of course. I should have seen that an hour ago, but my brain is on fire, owing to the torture these fiends have devised." "Are you quite safe here? It is an absurd question, but I would like to feel assured on that point. Shall I return and strengthen your guard?" "I'm exceedingly obliged to you, but in addition to 2 of my servants, thoroughly trustworthy men, a detective sergeant and constable have come from Scotland Yard. They are now having supper. When the household retires for the night, 2 will remain in this room, with the door open, and 2 in the butler's room, which commands the other staircase. Moreover, a constable will patrol this side of the square, and a second one the back of the premises, until long after daybreak." "Tell you what," said Handyside, when he and Theydon were in a taxi, and had made certain that they were not being followed. "Tell you what, son, you've struck a bonanza in this Chinese drama." "What do you mean?" said Theydon. Well, I guess you're the curly-haired boy where Miss Evelyn is concerned. Like most Americans, you jump at conclusions, was the ungracious reply. And like most Americans, I'm right nearly all the time, said Handyside dryly. Surely one can hardly discuss such a matter? Why not? If a proposition sounds hard, chew on it, and maybe you'll get your teeth into it somehow. Theydon nearly allowed himself to become angry. Was his hopeless admiration for Evelyn Forbes so patent that a sharp-eyed stranger could discern it after a brief hour in their company? Millionaires' daughters marry poor men only in novels and on the stage, he said bitterly. In real life, and in England, they take unto themselves titles and landed estates. I guess Wong Li Fu will have to round you up some more, was the cryptic answer, and Handyside forthwith plunged airily into some wholly different topic. At Scotland Yard they inquired for Furneaux, and were told he had not reported at headquarters since the early afternoon. So Theydon was introduced to another representative of the department, and handed over the typed note. The detective promised that its purport should be telephoned to Croydon without delay. When the two reached the Embankment again, Theydon felt unaccountably tired, and was minded to take leave of his companion then and there. But Handyside placed an unerring finger on the cause of his weariness. "Say, Mr. Theydon," he cried, "I don't know what food product arrangements you've made all day, but I couldn't have eaten less since breakfast if Wong Li Fu was sitting over me with a pistol. How about a square meal? Come to my hotel, and I'll start the chef on a nice little menu while we're having a wash-up and a brush-up." "By Jove, now I know what is the matter with me," was the astonishing answer. "I have lunched and dined on a cup of tea at Eastbourne." "Guess I'm 15 years older than you, so I knew my trouble all the time. Those people in Fortescue Square were so rattled that they never thought of asking us to eat. Come right along, it's only a step." "I'll come with pleasure. I owe you some money, too, which I was nearly forgetting." "What do you owe for?" "Railway tickets and taxis and motorcycles, to begin with." "No, sir," said the American decisively. "I've had the cheapest day's amusement I've ever dreamed of. On balance, I owe you 1 sovereign. As for those half tickets from Eastbourne, I wouldn't sell them for dollars and cents. When I get back to my home, 21097 Park Avenue, Chicago, I'll have those bits of cardboard framed, and when some particular friend asks the reason, I'll tell him, suppressing names, of course, and he'll go away thinking that George T. Handyside is the biggest liar in the state of Illinois, which is some pumpkin, you bet." "What beats me," rejoined Theydon, "is how you remember where you live. You must have a marvellous head for figures." So they dined well, and wined moderately, and Theydon walked to Innismore Mansions, thinking of little else in the world, except of the moment when he held Evelyn Forbes in his arms, almost in an embrace, and he had dared nearly, if not quite, to kiss her. As he drew near Innismore Mansions, however, he kept his wits about him. One of the most remarkable features of a series of remarkable crimes was the thorough command of the resources of civilization exhibited by the young Manchus. A few days earlier he would not have dared to introduce into a story of his own an association composed exclusively of Chinamen, which adapted to its needs the motor car, the messenger boy, perhaps the telephone and telegraph, to say nothing of the advertising columns of the daily press. It was monstrous to imagine that a number of Orientals, marked men every one, no matter what disguises they might adopt, should dare bid defiance to the forces of the British Constitution in order that they might wreak vengeance on those more enlightened compatriots who wished to see their country rescued from the effete control of a puppet emperor. But Theydon was now some days older and many degrees wiser. He knew that the wildly improbable had become dogged fact, that Chinese fanaticism, tigerish in its crafty and utter cold-bloodedness, was setting at naught not only the ordinances of the law, but the brightest intellects whose duty it was to make that law respected. It behoved him, therefore, to lend a sharp eye to his own safety, and never a vehicle or pedestrian came near, while he traversed the quiet streets in the neighbourhood of Innismore Mansions, that he did not give the closest attention to cab or wayfarer, as the case may be. As it happened, that quarter of London was singularly deserted. The first flight of people homeward bound from the theatres was well over. The later contingent, supping in restaurants, had not begun to arrive. Save for the slow-moving figure of a policeman, the long front of the mansions themselves was devoid of life. Nevertheless, it was with a feeling of relief that he turned the key in the lock of number 18, and heard the scraping of a chair on the kitchen floor as Bates rose to meet him. "Hello, Bates," he cried wearily. "Here I am again, you see. Anything new or interesting during my absence?" "Mrs. Paxton," began the valet, stopping when his master uttered a sharp exclamation. Theydon had completely forgotten Miss Beale and his sister. "Yes," he said. "Sorry I interrupted you. What of Mrs. Paxton?" "I saw her, sir, as you ordered, and she promised to call on Miss Beale. She came here about an hour ago." "Who, my sister?" "Yes, sir. She was anxious to see you. From what I could gather, sir, the two ladies had been putting their heads together, and agreed that this Chinese business has a nasty look, and you'd better keep out of it." "What Chinese business, Bates?" "Well, sir, Miss Beale will have it that Mrs. Lester was killed by a Chinaman, and one of the police on duty in this district told me a little while ago that he saw no less than 3 Chinamen prowling round here last Monday between dusk and dark." Theydon drew a deep breath. If there was gossip going on about Chinamen in connection with the murder in number 17, the newspapers would soon be getting hold of it. The arrest of Len Shi by Furneaux must be reported. Possibly some newspaper correspondent in Eastbourne would hear of the kidnapping exploit, and describe the eastern aspect of its chief actor. Mrs. Forbes's name would transpire in the paragraph, and by putting 2 and 2 together, the lynx-eyed journalism of London would ferret out a good deal of the truth. "Ladies very often talk nonsense about such things," he said sharply. "Why should any Chinaman single out poor Mrs. Lester as a victim? I think the inquiry may be left safely to Scotland Yard. Have you seen the evening papers? I'll bet you 6pence nothing was said at the inquest concerning Chinamen." "No, sir, that's true. However, Mrs. Paxton wants you to ring her up." "Why?" "She wants to be sure you are safe at home." Theydon laughed. "How can I?" he cried. "She is not on the telephone." "Mrs. Paxton left a number, sir. If you give them a call, it will be taken to her." Theydon shook his head good-humouredly, but obeyed. A voice at the other end answered. "Will you oblige me by telling Mrs. Paxton that I took an American friend to Eastbourne this afternoon, and returned by a late train?" he said. "Who is it, please?" "Mr. Theydon, Mrs. Paxton's brother." "Oh, I have a message for you. Miss Beale is staying with Mrs. Paxton to-night. There was a Chinaman in her hotel, and she didn't like it." Theydon controlled his feelings sufficiently to thank his informant. He really wanted to say something crude. "Gad," he muttered when he had rung off, "these women have Chinamen on the brain. Look here, Bates," he added emphatically, "I hope you won't lend an ear to this nonsense. You've seen no Chinamen, I suppose?" "No, sir." "If you do see one, tell me, and I'll get to know his business pretty quick." "Yes, sir." "Any letters?" "3, sir, and a small parcel. I put them on your table. Shall I get you something, sir?" "No, thanks. I've just had a huge supper. Good night." "Good night, sir. Any orders for the morning?" "Let me sleep as long as I like, unless I'm wanted." Theydon entered the sitting-room. He opened the letters. 2 were of no moment. The third was a request from the editor of a magazine that the copy of his article on the Forbes peace propaganda should be forwarded as speedily as practicable. What a mad world it was, to be sure! Here was an important periodical waiting impatiently for the views of the millionaire on the best means of securing peace on earth and goodwill to all men, while that same mastermind was obsessed with fear of a few Chinese bandits. Society was looking to Forbes for a promised panacea against war and its evils. Forbes himself was wondering whether bolts and locks and armed servants and policemen would protect him and his from the claws of the young Manchus. Theydon heard Bates locking and bolting the outer door of the flat with a certain thankfulness. He was thinking of the sheer impossibility of any marauder gaining access to number 18, when he opened the small parcel which the valet had spoken of. He speculated idly as to the nature of its contents, because he could not remember having ordered any article which would be contained in so tiny a package. He took out a piece of stout paper, folded twice, and a little white object fell to the table and rolled over several times, finally coming to rest with a curious suddenness. It was a small carved ivory skull.